The first time London really noticed Wallis Simpson, it was not because of her looks, it was because she did not look away. A dining room in Mayfair, all polished silver and low lamps, the sort of place where laughter sounded trained. A prince sat at the centre, perfectly dressed, perfectly bored, his smile arriving on time like a butler. Women leaned in with careful compliments. Men offered stories that had been told too often, and everyone pretended it was new. Then a slim American woman in a dark dress turned her head and met his eyes, as if she were inspecting a painting she might buy, or not buy, depending on the light. It was a small thing, a glance. In that world, small things could be explosives. Her name was Wallis, and the first rumour attached to her was not romance, it was personality. People said she had a voice that could make you feel chosen, and a tongue that could make you feel dismissed. People said she knew exactly which fork to use, and exactly which secret to repeat. People said she could be delightful for an hour and dangerous forever. In a city built on manners, Wallis had the nerve to behave as if manners were optional, and somehow she still got invited back. Britain would later decide she was a villain. Britain loves a villain who dresses well. But the trouble with villains is that they do not begin as villains. They begin as women at dinner, laughing at jokes a second too late, watching everything, and working out where the power truly sits. Wallis came from Baltimore, which already made some people in London narrow their eyes, as if a map could be a moral test. She was born Bessie Wallis Warfield, a name with respectable edges and a soft middle. Her father died when she was still small, leaving her mother to make do with family help and careful appearances. It was the kind of childhood where you learn early that a pleasant face is a form of currency, and where you understand, even if no one says it out loud, that comfort can vanish with one bad season. She was raised among relatives who loved her and also watched her, because that is what families do when money is limited and a girl is pretty. She went to a good school and learned to move through rooms without tripping over herself or other people's feelings. She learned the art of looking impressed while making mental notes. She learned how to flatter without sounding foolish. She also learned, and this part mattered later, that being agreeable is not the same as being safe. As a young woman, she wanted more than Baltimore could offer. Not because Baltimore was small, but because her hunger was large. She wanted movement, stories, glamour. She wanted to be the woman others noticed. The first time she got close to that dream, she married a naval officer named Earl Winfield Spencer. He was charming at the start, like many men who turn out to be exhausting. With him came travel, uniforms, parties, new cities, and the unsteady life of a wife who must keep smiling even when the ground shifts. Spencer drank. Sometimes he drank in the way people excuse, a little too much at the club, a little too loud at the end of the night. Sometimes he drank in the way that empties a marriage of tenderness and fills it with fear. Wallis followed him from post to post, doing what wives were expected to do, hosting, dressing, deflecting. She did not have the luxury of a dramatic collapse. She had learned too young that a woman who falls apart is treated like a nuisance, not a tragedy. They separated. They reunited. They separated again. There were whispers of violence, of humiliations, of scenes that happened behind closed doors and then were sealed shut with a fresh coat of lipstick and a new hat. Wallis was not the sort of woman who wrote heartfelt confessions for strangers to read. She moved on by moving forward, and if she had to harden herself to do it, she did. Divorce was still a social bruise, even in America, and in the circles Wallis wanted, it was worse. But she had a talent for turning disadvantages into introductions. The story became not that she had failed at marriage, but that she had survived one. She spoke about it with a lightness that made listeners lean closer. A woman who can joke about pain is assumed to be either brave or unfeeling. Wallis did not correct anyone. After Spencer came another man, steadier on paper, better connected in practice. Ernest Simpson was a businessman with British ties, A man who moved between London and the continent with the ease of someone who always had a ticket and never had to ask the price. He was not dazzling, but he was useful, which in some marriages is the more enduring quality. Wallis married him and took his name, stepping into the kind of life she had wanted when she was a girl looking past Baltimore. London, clubs, country houses, invitations that arrived on thick cardstock and carried meaning beyond the dinner itself. The thing about London society, especially in the years after the Great War, is that it was both changing and determined not to admit it. People drank more, danced more, gambled more, and spoke more openly about affairs, as long as those affairs followed certain rules. A husband could stray if his wife looked the other way and the newspapers stayed polite. A wife could have a discreet arrangement if it did not embarrass anyone important. The real sin was not sex, it was disorder. Wallis understood this quickly. She was a student of the hidden syllabus. She watched who greeted whom first. She watched which women were tolerated and which women were iced out, and why. She listened for the real verdicts, the ones delivered with a smile and a pause. She learned how to dress for English taste, sharper than American sweetness, more line than lace. She learned how to turn her accent into a feature, not a flaw, and how to make her frankness sound like freshness instead of rudeness. She also learned that the British adored an American woman as long as she behaved like a novelty, not a competitor. The moment she seemed to be playing for higher stakes, the mood changed. People will clap for you until they suspect you might win. By the early 1930s, the Prince of Wales was the most eligible man in the world and, in private, one of the loneliest. Edward was handsome in the way photographs loved, with a quick smile and eyes that seemed to search for amusement like a man hunting for oxygen. He had been raised inside rules so tight they might as well have been stitched into his skin. Public duty, private restraint. He performed it beautifully, which only made it feel more like a trap. He was adored by crowds. He was also watched, corrected, managed. Courtiers hovered like anxious birds. His father, King George V, believed discipline was love. His mother, Queen Mary, believed duty was destiny. Between them, Edward grew into a man who could charm a room and still feel like he had no home inside his own life. He liked modern things. He liked American music, American movies, American energy. He liked women who spoke to him like a person, not like a monument. Over the years, he had collected affairs with married women because married women came with boundaries already set, and because those relationships allowed him the illusion of control. No talk of marriage, no talk of heirs, just companionship and escape, wrapped in discretion. The women around him also collected something, access. A mistress of the Prince of Wales could open doors, settle debts, rescue a reputation, or ruin one. It was a strange economy, half romance and half strategy. Some women fell in love, some women fell into opportunity. Many did both and called it fate. One of the Prince favourites was Thelma Furness, an American socialite who had married into British aristocracy and moved through London like she had been born in it. Thelma was pretty, clever and practical enough to know that a royal affair was never entirely private. She played the role well, entertaining Edward, soothing him, and keeping the mood light. She also did the thing many women do when they feel secure. She introduced a friend. That friend was Wallis Simpson. It happened at a house party, the kind that lasted days and blurred into itself, with hunting in the morning and cocktails before lunch, with bridge and gossip and late nights that felt like harmless mischief until someone remembered what the newspapers could do. Wallis arrived as a guest, not a headline. She had the faintly bored confidence of a woman who had decided she belonged wherever she stood. Edward noticed her because she did not swoon. When he spoke, she did not flutter. She smiled, yes, but it was the smile of someone weighing a joke, not worshipping a title. When he expected admiration, she offered conversation. When he expected obedience, she offered teasing. To the men around them, it looked like flirtation. To the women, it looked like insubordination, which was far more interesting. Wallis had a gift for making men feel both challenged and understood. She did it with tone, with timing, with that American directness that could land like a slap and then immediately soften into laughter. If Edward made a remark that was meant to dazzle, Wallis would respond as if he was simply another man at the table, and somehow that made him shine more. He did not want to be treated like a prince. He wanted to be treated like a man who had been trapped as a prince. There was also something else, quieter. Edward was surrounded by people who wanted things from him. Wallis seemed, at least at first, to want nothing. She was married. She was not begging for jewels. She was not pleading for favours. She was enjoying herself. For a man whose entire life was a chain of expectations, a woman who appeared free could feel like salvation. Of course, she was not free. Wallis had spent her whole life negotiating dependence. She knew exactly what it meant to need a man, and also what it meant to resent him for it. If she ever dreamed of freedom, she understood it would have to be constructed, not granted. That made her cautious, and also ambitious. Caution keeps you alive. Ambition makes you dangerous. The first weeks after that party, Wallis was simply in the orbit. She attended dinners where Edward appeared. She listened more than she spoke when the room required it. She spoke boldly when the room needed waking up. She became, in the eyes of society, the amusing American wife of Ernest Simpson, a couple with good taste and a talent for hosting. Ernest, by all accounts, liked stability. He liked a smooth life. He liked his wife. He also liked not being embarrassed. Edward began to call. At first it was casual, a note, an invitation, a suggestion of a gathering. Then it became more pointed. He asked after her opinions. He asked if she would be present. He arranged his calendar around rooms where she might be. People noticed. People always notice. The trick is deciding what to do with what you notice. The British court had its own weather system, and it could sense a storm long before the rest of London felt a drop. Men in stiff collars and older women with unblinking eyes watched the Prince of Wales and quietly counted risks. An American, a divorcee, married, yes, but marriage had never stopped Edward before, and it had never stopped society from whispering. Even the language around Wallis began to harden. In some rooms she was called amusing, in others she was called pushy. A few used nastier words, the kind that sound like they belong to moral judgment, but are really about class. Wallis had not been born to their rules, and she was not properly afraid of them. That alone was enough to offend. What did Wallis want, really? That question followed her like perfume. Some said she wanted a title. Some said she wanted money. Some said she wanted revenge on a world that had made her beg as a girl. Some said she wanted the thrill of winning, the satisfaction of taking something that was supposed to be untouchable. The truth was messier. She wanted control over her own life. She also liked being adored. She liked being the centre of a story. She liked the small power of being the person a prince waited for. Edward, for his part, wanted relief. He wanted a place where he did not have to be perfect. He wanted a woman who could mother him and mock him in the same sentence. He wanted warmth and excitement and loyalty, and he wanted it without the relentless weight of duty. He did not see himself as selfish. He saw himself as starving. And Ernest Simpson. Ernest wanted quiet. Ernest wanted predictability. Ernest wanted his wife to stop attracting headlines that had not yet been printed. At first, Wallis and Edward were careful in the way people are careful when they still believe they can control the ending. They met at parties, at dinners, at weekends where the guest lists were full enough to provide cover. Edward would laugh too loudly at Wallis' remarks, then catch himself. Wallis would tilt her head and smile, then step away, as if to prove to herself she could. Thelma Furness watched, of course. Thelma was not foolish. She had lived long enough to know that no affair is protected by sentiment. She also knew the Prince of Wales well enough to understand that boredom was his true enemy. A man can be loyal to a woman for years and then abandon her in an afternoon if he finds someone who makes him feel more alive. Still, Thelma did not strike immediately. There are moments when you sense danger but tell yourself it is too rude to accuse it. Thelma had introduced Wallis. Thelma had vouched for her. To turn on her now would make Thelma look insecure, and insecurity is the one thing a royal mistress is never allowed to show. So the triangle formed quietly, like a crack in a ceiling that everyone pretends is only paint. The more Edward sought Wallis, the more Wallis changed the atmosphere around him. The courtiers felt it, his staff felt it, his friends felt it. He began to speak of her as if she were a necessary ingredient in the day. He began to resist plans that did not include her. He began to look impatient with the women who had once been enough. Wallis, meanwhile, began to test what she could do. She teased Edward about his habits, his clothes, his fussiness. She urged him to eat differently, to rest differently, to live differently. Some found it outrageous. Who was this American woman to advise a future king? Others found it thrilling. The Prince of Wales, brought to heel by a woman with a Baltimore accent and a sharp eye. It sounded like a comedy, until it began to feel like a revolution. There were evenings when Wallis returned home and found Ernest reading, calm, distant, perhaps already resigned. There were mornings when she woke with a strange combination of triumph and dread. She was not a girl in a romantic novel. She was a grown woman who understood consequences. She also understood that consequences arrive whether you invite them or not. At least this way, she would be holding the steering wheel. Edward wrote. He sent messages through friends. He used the full force of his charm, and behind the charm there was a pressure that could feel like devotion or like demand. Edward was used to getting what he wanted. The world was arranged to make it so. When he did not get what he wanted, he sulked, he insisted, he pleaded. He could be boyish and manipulative in the same breath. Wallis saw it and, instead of recoiling, she learned how to handle it. In some ways, she had been training for this her whole life. She began to appear more often. She began to take up more space. She began to belong. And then, because London cannot resist a story, the tone shifted again. The whispers turned sour. People who had laughed at her jokes began to call her calculating. Women who had invited her began to leave her name off the list. Men who had praised her charm began to warn their wives that she was trouble. It was as if the room had decided all at once that her presence was not just entertaining, but threatening. The Prince of Wales did not notice the social frost at first because he was wrapped in the heat of his own feelings. When he did notice, he bristled. Edward hated being told no. He hated being managed. He hated the idea that his friends and his family could veto his happiness. Every raised eyebrow at Wallis felt like an insult to him. Every polite snub felt like a challenge. Wallis watched all of this with a coolness that could read as confidence or cruelty, depending on who was telling the tale. She did not beg for acceptance. She did not apologize for existing. If anything, the disapproval hardened her. If they were going to hate her anyway, she might as well get something out of it. It is easy to paint her as purely cold, but there was vulnerability under the polish, and it showed at strange moments. A glance that lingered too long on an affectionate couple, a sudden sharpness when someone mentioned divorce, an impatience with sentimental talk, as if sentiment were a trap that had closed on her before. Wallis had learned that love could humiliate you. She had also learned that power could protect you. She did not want to be humiliated again. Edward, on the other hand, wanted to be cared for in a way that did not feel like duty. He wanted to put his head in someone's lap and be told he was wonderful, and also be told he was ridiculous. Wallis could do both. Wallis could soothe and scold. Wallis could make him feel like the most important man in the world and the most normal man in the world, sometimes in the same minute. That combination is intoxicating. By the time the season turned and the parties moved from country houses back into London drawing rooms, the question was no longer whether Edward liked Wallis. The question was what he was prepared to do about it, and what Wallis would allow herself to become. There were still people who thought it would burn out, that the prince would tire of her, that she would wisely retreat, that Ernest would quietly take his wife abroad, that Thelma would resume her position, that everything would return to its familiar shape. Society loves to believe that chaos will tidy itself. But then Edward began to arrange his life around one woman, and the one woman was still married, and she had already been divorced once, and England had a church that did not forgive easily, and a monarchy that survived on the public belief that it was sturdier than ordinary human appetite. In the softer light of those early days, it still looked like gossip, like a juicy story to trade over tea. Wallis Simpson, the clever American with the dangerous smile, the Prince of Wales, the restless heir who could not bear to be lonely. It sounded like romance if you wanted it to. It sounded like scandal if you needed it to. In private, Edward began to confide in Wallis with a seriousness that made even her pause. He spoke about his childhood, his parents, the suffocating expectations. He spoke about becoming king as if it were a sentence, not a crown. He spoke as if she were the only person who understood that he had been performing his whole life. Wallis listened. Wallis always listened. And somewhere between the listening and the laughter, between the dinner invitations and the late-night messages, the story passed a point that could not be easily undone. Not because a prince had fallen in love, princes do that all the time, but because this prince had begun to act like love was a form of rebellion, and because the woman he had chosen was the sort of woman Britain did not know how to forgive. Once you step over that invisible line, the one between flirtation and consequence, you start noticing how quickly a life can rearrange itself around a single name. Edward began to say Wallis the way a man says home, not as a place he lives, but as a place he longs for. At first, the rearranging looked harmless. A dinner moved so she could attend. A weekend plan changed because she had a headache. A note arrived with a joke that only she would understand. The palace staff, trained to treat every preference like an order, learned her rhythms. If the prince sounded restless, someone would suggest a party where Mrs. Simpson might be present. If he seemed low, someone would quietly place a telephone within reach. These were not commands spoken aloud, which made them more powerful. Everyone could pretend nothing improper was happening, even as the whole machine began to bend around one woman. Wallis played her part with a steadiness that made people uneasy. She did not behave like a dizzy romantic. She behaved like a woman who had counted the cost and still decided to take the risk. There is something about that kind of composure that makes other women defensive. It suggests planning. It suggests appetite. It suggests a woman who believes she can win. Thelma Furness sensed it before anyone dared say it. She had been the Prince of Wales' companion long enough to recognise the change in his attention. He used to be hungry and satisfied within the same week. With Wallis, his hunger did not end. It sharpened. He began to look at Thelma as if she were a familiar chair. Comfortable, sure, but not thrilling. Thelma was used to competition, but she had not expected it from someone she had welcomed. She made a mistake that has ruined many clever women. She left town. The official reason was ordinary: family obligations, travel, a change of air. The real reason was more complicated, and in its own way more human. Thelma believed she still mattered. She believed Edward would miss her. She believed Wallis was an entertaining visitor, not a replacement. She believed that a prince who had been hers would remain hers because she had been there first. London taught her otherwise. London has a particular talent for turning a woman's absence into a vacancy. With Thelma away, the prince did not sulk quietly. He pursued. He began to call Wallis more often and to do it with less camouflage. He would appear where she was. He would insist on driving her home after dinner. He would send flowers, then a bracelet, then something more personal, a book with a note inside that sounded, even on paper, like a man holding someone's hand. Wallis did not keep these gestures secret from everyone, but she kept them secret from the people who mattered. She understood that the danger was not a jealous friend or a gossip columnist. The danger was the court. The danger was the king. The danger was the church and the public and the thin thread of faith that held the monarchy steady. Her marriage to Ernest began to look like a carefully arranged room with the window shut. Ernest was polite, reliable, and increasingly irrelevant. He knew what was happening, of course. Men like Ernest always know. The question is what they can bear to admit. Wallis and Ernest had become a couple that functioned well in society. Their dinners were admired. Their guest lists were excellent. Their home felt modern and composed, like a magazine spread, and yet inside that polished life, something had shifted. Wallis had a new electricity. She would leave the room to take calls. She would return with a brightness that did not belong to her husband. Ernest would watch, then look away, because looking too directly would force a confrontation. If you asked Wallis later, she might have insisted she did not mean for it to go so far. She might have said she had tried to discourage the prince, that she had warned him, that she had intended to remain sensible. Those claims have a certain elegance, and Wallis always preferred elegance. But the truth is that she did not retreat. She did not cut him off. She did not vanish to America. She stayed. Some of it was pleasure. Edward was charming, attentive, and persistent. He made her feel rare. He made her feel chosen. Some of it was power, the heady awareness that she could influence a man who had never been allowed to be influenced. And some of it was something darker and more personal. Wallis had spent years being at the mercy of other people's decisions. Here was a chance to be the decision. Edward, for all his confidence in public, could become anxious in private. He wanted reassurance as if it were oxygen. He wrote notes that were too emotional for a man in his position, notes that sounded like the diary of a boy who had just discovered his heart. When he felt Wallis pull back, he would press harder. When she teased him, he would cling. It was not a balanced dance, it was a man begging to be anchored. Wallis was not sentimental, but she was not immune. There are women who do not crave romance itself, but crave being needed. It is a quieter hunger, and it can be just as consuming. The more attached Edward became, the more Wallis found herself in a delicate position. She could not simply accept him like a gift, because he was not a man free to give himself. He belonged to a crown that was not yet his, to a public that adored him, to a family that would never forgive embarrassment. She could not even publicly claim him, because she was still married. And yet she could not easily discard him, because he was not the sort of man you discard without consequences. A prince does not accept rejection like an ordinary lover. He interprets it as betrayal. So she managed him. That word alone can make people furious, especially when it is applied to a woman. When a man directs a woman's life, it is called leadership. When a woman directs a man's feelings, it is called manipulation. Wallis did not help her own case by being so competent at it. She knew how to calm Edward when he was sulking. She knew how to provoke him when he was dull. She knew how to flatter him while also pushing him gently into choices that suited her. She began to advise him on clothes, on friends, on how to behave in public. Sometimes the advice was sensible, even helpful. Sometimes it was simply the pleasure of influence. Either way, it made the people around Edward bristle. Courtiers did not mind mistresses. They minded mistresses who acted like they had authority. In those circles, people loved to say they were protecting the monarchy. What they were often protecting was the old arrangement: men in charge, women in the shadows, the crown above scandal as long as scandal was neatly contained. Wallis was not neatly contained. She had opinions. She had a laugh that carried. She had the audacity to correct the Prince of Wales in front of other people. Even when she did it playfully, it landed like a small rebellion. The men at court began to trade quiet warnings. Some said she was vulgar. Some said she was ambitious. Some said she was cruel. It became fashionable to describe her as hard. And once a woman is labelled hard, everything she does is interpreted through that lens. A joke becomes an insult. A boundary becomes a scheme. A calm face becomes proof of coldness. The women were sharper. They watched her posture, her earrings, her eyes. They complained that she did not have the right kind of softness, the right kind of gratitude. They said she did not curtsy properly. They said she did not respect tradition. They said she treated people like servants. They said she treated people like furniture. Some of these accusations were unfair, some were not. Wallis could be rude, she could be impatient, she could dismiss people with a sentence that sounded like a compliment until you realized it was a blade. She did not always bother to hide her contempt when she thought someone was being dull or pompous. She had survived a world that rewarded sharpness, and she had learned to use it. Edward, strangely, loved her for it. Her sharpness made him feel bold by association. He had spent his whole life being told to be careful, to be proper, to be restrained. Wallis' restraint was selective. It felt like freedom. As months passed, the private relationship became harder to deny. Friends began to adjust their invitations. Some stopped inviting Wallis entirely. Others invited her more because proximity to scandal can be irresistible when you are bored. A few women decided that if the Prince of Wales wanted her, then she must have something worth copying. They began to imitate her clothing, her clipped phrases, her modern hair. In London, imitation is both flattery and reconnaissance. Ernest, meanwhile, was stuck in a humiliating kind of silence. He could not order his wife to stop. That would require admitting openly what was happening. He could not appeal to the Prince of Wales because men like Ernest do not make demands of royalty. He could only endure, and endurance can make a man brittle. At dinners, Ernest would smile and speak to Edward with polite warmth. He would make conversation. He would laugh at jokes. He would accept the Prince's presence in his home as if it were an honour, which it was, and also a theft. Some people admired Ernest's composure. Others found it pathetic. London can be cruel to a man who looks cuckolded, even when everyone is benefiting from the performance. Wallis did not want to be seen as a homewrecker, but she also did not want to be seen as a woman begging for permission. So she maintained an air of calm. She hosted, she dressed, she attended. She lived as if nothing improper was happening because in her mind, propriety was something other people used to control her. She would not be controlled. In private, Edward became more intense. He began to speak of love in terms that sounded like inevitability. He began to imagine a future that did not exist yet. He did not merely want Wallis, he wanted her permanently. That frightened her more than the affair itself. Affairs are messy, but they are also temporary by nature. They have rules, even if unspoken. A prince takes a mistress. The mistress provides comfort. The world pretends not to see. Then the prince moves on, or the mistress does, and everyone survives with their reputations more or less intact. Edward did not want that arrangement. Edward wanted a wife. Wallis did not tell him yes, not immediately. She did not tell him no either, because no can be a weapon in the hands of a man who feels entitled. She let the idea hover. She allowed him to dream. She kept him close. There is a tenderness in that, and there is also calculation. Wallis was always doing two things at once. The court began to gather evidence the way a household gathers firewood, quietly and steadily, preparing for a season they hoped to avoid. People listened to servants. People read letters when they could. People watched the prince's schedule. A few discreet figures tried to steer him back towards a safer company. There were eligible women, respectable women, women with the correct blood and the correct innocence. Edward showed no interest. He had tasted something else, and he had decided it was what he needed. King George V, aging and increasingly ill, did not have patience for drama. He believed in duty with the force of a religion. To him, the monarchy was not a family story. It was a national structure. It could not bend to personal appetite without cracking. When word reached him that his eldest son had become attached to a married American divorcee, the king did not respond with romantic outrage. He responded with disgust. His wife, Queen Mary, was colder in a different way. She was not cruel exactly, but she was deeply committed to the idea that the crown must be protected from ordinary mess. Queen Mary had endured her own unhappiness without complaint. She could not respect a man who refused to do the same. In their world, suffering was part of the job. Wallis, by contrast, seemed to believe she should not suffer simply because tradition demanded it. That belief was, to them, indecent. The Prince of Wales began to feel the resistance around him, and instead of yielding, he pushed back. He had always resented the way his parents treated him like a problem to be managed. Now he had a cause. If they opposed Wallis, he could frame himself as a man fighting for love, rather than a man dodging responsibility. It was a tempting story to tell himself. Wallis watched that story develop and understood its danger. It could elevate her into a symbol she did not fully control. She did not want to be a banner. She wanted to be safe. And yet safety was already slipping away. One of the quietest, nastiest aspects of British high society was how it could punish without screaming. They did not need to shout insults. They could simply stop. Stop calling. Stop inviting. Stop smiling. Stop pretending you existed. Wallis began to feel the cold in certain rooms. A hostess might greet her with stiff politeness, then turn away as if distracted. A woman who used to ask Wallis to lunch might suddenly be too busy for weeks. A man who once flirted might now look through her. Each small gesture was a message. You are tolerated until you threaten the structure. Wallis could handle disapproval, but she hated being dismissed. Being dismissed made her feel like the poor girl in Baltimore again, the girl dependent on other people's charity. She had vowed never to be that girl. She responded the only way she knew, by becoming more controlled, more polished, more deliberate. If they wanted to freeze her out, she would become impossible to ignore. Her home became a stage where her taste could not be questioned. Her parties became sharper, better, more modern than the tired gatherings of older aristocrats. She cultivated friends who enjoyed being near danger. She relied on a smaller circle, the sort of people who valued excitement over approval. Some of those friends were not the kind of friends a future king should have leaned on. They were witty, cynical, and sometimes careless. Their loyalties were social, not moral. They could be delightful at midnight and treacherous by breakfast. Edward did not always recognize that. He was so hungry for warmth that he mistook fascination for devotion. Wallis recognized it perfectly. She had lived among people like that for years. People who smiled while measuring what you could do for them. She knew how to keep them close without trusting them. But the more Edward entered that circle, the more he became exposed. The scandal was not yet public in the newspapers, at least not in the British ones. There was a gentleman agreement, a quiet understanding that the press would not print what could destabilize the monarchy. That agreement depended on discretion. It depended on everyone behaving as if nothing were happening. The trouble was that Edward was no longer discreet. He was no longer satisfied with stolen moments. He wanted Wallis beside him openly. He began to bring her into situations where her presence was provocative. He invited her to places where the line between private and public blurred. He treated her as if she were already his, as if the world should adjust. People who cared about the monarchy began to panic. People who cared about gossip began to salivate. Thelma Furness returned to London and discovered, with a kind of icy clarity, that the vacancy had been filled. Edward greeted her politely, even affectionately, but the warmth was gone. He did not need her anymore. Thelma did what women in her position often do when they realize the truth. She tried to regain control with charm. She tried to remind him of their history. She tried to make Wallis seem like a temporary distraction. Edward did not respond. He had moved past the stage where a man can be teased back into compliance. He was in the stage where he believes the new woman understands him in a way no one else ever has. Once a man reaches that stage, reason becomes almost useless. Thelma, wounded and furious, began to speak more sharply about Wallis. Some of what she said may have been true, some may have been revenge. Either way, the words landed in rooms that were ready to hear them. The idea of Wallis as a nasty piece of work began to take shape not from one clear accusation, but from many small ones, each repeated with just enough certainty to sound like fact. They said she kept a list of people she disliked. They said she mocked the royal family behind their backs. They said she demanded gifts. They said she bullied staff. They said she was cold to friends who were no longer useful. They said she had a talent for making men ridiculous. The last one, unfortunately, had proof. Edward began to look slightly ridiculous, not because he loved her, but because he behaved like a man who could not bear a single hour without her. He would call her repeatedly. He would sulk if she was occupied. He would interrupt his own routine for her. He would write notes that sounded like a man begging to be allowed into the room. To women watching from the outside, it looked less like romance and more like obsession. An obsessed man is never flattering to the woman he obsesses over. It suggests she has cast a spell. It suggests she has done something unnatural. In a country that prized emotional restraint, Edward's lack of restraint made Wallis seem even more suspect. Wallis did not help by enjoying, at least occasionally, the sight of a prince made helpless. She had been powerless in her first marriage, at the mercy of a man drinking and moods. Now she had a man of immense status asking for her attention like a favour. It must have felt in some private corner of her mind like balance restored. Her marriage to Ernest continued to unravel politely. There were no dramatic public fights. Ernest was not that type. He withdrew. He became quieter at dinners. He travelled more. He stayed out of the way. He and Wallis began to live parallel lives under the same roof. There were moments when Wallis could have chosen a different path. She could have pushed Edward away. She could have taken Ernest and left London. She could have sought a quiet divorce and remarried someone less explosive. But she had already tasted the peak of attention, the sense of being the axis around which a royal life turned. It is very difficult to step away from that and return to being merely admired. Edward, meanwhile, began to nurture his resentment towards those who disapproved. He spoke about the court as if it were a prison. He complained about courtiers as if they were enemies. He confided in Wallis as if she were his only ally. It was a dangerous dynamic, because it turned love into a siege. When two people believe the world is against them, they cling harder, even when clinging harms them. Wallis could be soothing, but she could also be provocative. If Edward spoke bitterly about his parents, she did not scold him into gratitude. She listened. If he complained about duty, she did not remind him of his responsibility. She made him feel justified. She had never been a woman who worshipped institutions. She had been bruised by them. So when Edward attacked the rules, she did not defend the rules. She enjoyed watching them bend. Not always. There were nights when the weight of it made her quiet. There were moments when she seemed suddenly tired, as if she could see the cliff edge and did not know how to stop walking. Wallis was not a fool. She understood that if Edward became king and insisted on keeping her, the crisis would not be social. It would be constitutional. a word that sounds dry until you understand it means the whole nation arguing about one woman in public. She also understood something else, something that must have made her stomach tighten. Britain could forgive a prince for being weak. Britain could forgive a man for falling in love. Britain rarely forgave the woman, especially if she was foreign, divorced, and unapologetic. The label was forming around her like a net, nasty, calculating, dangerous. Some of it came from real behaviour. Wallis could be sharp. She could be dismissive. She had the kind of humour that cuts, and she did not always care who bled. She had opinions about people faces, people accents, people manners, and she voiced those opinions in a world where people live or die socially by what is said behind their backs. She could be kind to someone on Monday and cruel about them on Tuesday. That inconsistency made people fear her. They did not know which Wallis they would get. But some of it came from something simpler. She was a woman who did not act grateful. In those days, women were expected to accept male attention with modesty, to pretend they were surprised by devotion. Wallis did not pretend. She acted as if Edward devotion was natural, even deserved. That alone was enough to make other women furious, because it suggested a kind of confidence they had been taught to suppress. Edward began to bring her into his personal inner life in ways that alarmed his staff. He invited her to Fort Belvedere, his private home, a place that served as his refuge from the official world. Fort Belvedere was not just a house, it was a symbol. It was where he could be himself, and he chose to make her part of that self. Within those walls, their relationship deepened. He laughed more, he complained more, he relaxed. He became, in his mind, a real person rather than a royal object. Wallis became the gatekeeper of that comfort. If she was pleased, the atmosphere was light. If she was irritated, the atmosphere tightened. Staff began to look to her moods as much as his. That was not merely intimate, it was political. People around Edward began to take sides, quietly at first. Some believed he was in love and should be left alone. Some believed Wallis was a menace. Some simply wanted to avoid being dragged into it. A few, always present in any scandal, saw opportunity. They could attach themselves to Wallis and gain access to Edward. They could whisper to Edward and gain influence. They could play both sides and profit from confusion. Wallis, who had always been a sharp judge of motive, began to feel crowded. She was no longer merely a woman with a secret affair. She was becoming a centre of gravity. That attracts parasites. She also began to feel, in a way she could not fully admit, that she was losing control. The affair had begun as a game of careful steps. Now Edward was rushing ahead, pulling her along, dragging the whole country toward a question no one wanted to ask out loud. What would happen if he refused to let her go? In the meantime, life continued with the stubbornness of ordinary days. Wallis hosted lunches. Edward attended official events. The king grew weaker. The public cheered the prince, unaware of the drama unfolding behind curtains. And London, ever restless, kept whispering. There were stories, of course. One story said Wallis had been intimate with other men, even as Edward pursued her, that she kept lovers because she liked control more than devotion. Another said she was desperately trying to get away from Edward, but he would not allow it. Another said Ernest and Wallis had an arrangement, that he accepted the prince because it brought them prestige. Another said Ernest was miserable and humiliated and simply too polite to make a scene. The truth contained fragments of many stories. Ernest did seem unhappy. Wallis did seem both attached and trapped. Edward did seem determined. And London did seem hungry. As the months moved on, Edward began to speak of divorce in a way that made the air in rooms go colder. Divorce was not just a personal event. In that world, it was a moral stain, and in the royal world, it was a threat. The Church of England was tied to the crown in a way that made the idea of a divorced queen nearly unthinkable. Wallis had already been divorced once. If she divorced Ernest, she would be a woman with 2 living ex-husbands, and that fact alone would become a wall. Edward did not want to hear about walls. He had spent his whole life being told where walls were. He wanted someone to climb them with him. Wallis listened to him talk, and you can almost imagine the calculation in her mind, not the cold calculation of a cartoon villain, but the practical calculation of a woman trying to survive a situation that had grown bigger than her. If she left him, she risked his fury, his heartbreak, his revenge. If she stayed, she risked becoming the most hated woman in Britain. And she was beginning to suspect that the hatred was already waiting, like a crowd gathering before a trial. One evening, after a dinner that felt particularly sharp, with smiles that did not reach eyes and compliments that sounded like warnings, Wallis returned home and found Ernest sitting quietly. He looked up at her the way a man looks at someone he has already lost. He did not shout. He did not accuse. He simply said something small, something like, "This cannot go on." Wallis, who could slice through other people with a sentence, did not have a clean answer. She was not a woman who liked helplessness, and yet she was, facing something she could not solve with charm. She could not charm the church. She could not charm the Constitution. She could not charm a nation into accepting her. What she could do, and what she was already doing, was hold on to Edward, because Edward had made himself something she could not easily drop. He was not just a lover, he was a destiny, and destiny, once it settles into a relationship, begins to demand payment. In the weeks that followed, Wallis began to tighten her circle. She became more guarded about whom she spoke to. She stopped trusting certain friends. She stopped laughing quite so freely at the wrong tables. She moved with more caution, as if she could sense that a single careless moment might turn whispers into something sharper. But Edward grew less cautious, not more. He wanted her visible. He wanted her acknowledged. He wanted the world to accept what he had decided. That difference in their instincts, her caution and his impatience, was a warning of the trouble ahead. Because a woman can manage a man's devotion, but she cannot always manage his recklessness. And when the man happens to be the future king, his recklessness is not merely personal. It is a national risk. By the time the year began to tip toward a darker season, the story had settled into the bones of London. People no longer asked whether the Prince of Wales was involved with Mrs. Simpson. They asked how far it would go. They asked who would break first. They asked whether Wallis would push for divorce. They asked whether the court would push her out. They asked, sometimes with a smile, sometimes with real fear, whether the crown could survive a woman who had never learned to be afraid of it. Wallis did not answer Ernest right away. She moved through the house as if she had misplaced something and needed to find it before she could speak. She took off her gloves with particular care. She straightened a vase that did not need straightening. She could feel Ernest watching her in that quiet way that men do when they have decided not to fight, which is somehow more accusing than shouting. Finally she said, in a voice that tried for lightness and landed on steel, "What would you have me do?" Ernest gave her the kind of look husbands give wives when they realize they are speaking different languages. He wanted a normal marriage. Wallis wanted a life that could not be taken from her by someone else's mood, someone else's bottle, someone else's sermon. They had been pretending those wants could live in the same rooms. Now the pretending was thin. "I would have you stop humiliating me," Ernest said, and it was almost gentle, which made it worse. Humiliation. That was the word. Not love, not betrayal, not heartbreak. Humiliation. It was the word a man uses when his pride is bleeding. Wallis could understand that, if nothing else. Pride was her oldest companion. She sat down very straight, as if posture could create order. "You are not a helpless man, Ernest," she said. "No one is forcing you to remain." He blinked, as if she had slapped him with politeness. "That is your solution. That I leave." Wallis held his gaze. Perhaps it is the only one. It was a cruel exchange dressed in civilized clothing, and it was also the first time Wallis allowed herself to say aloud what she had been circling for months. Ernest was an obstacle now, not because he had done anything monstrous, not because he deserved punishment, simply because he existed, and his existence made Wallis' story inconvenient. That is the part people rarely forgive. They will forgive a woman for loving badly. They will not forgive her for treating a decent man like a suitcase she no longer needs. The next day she went out as usual, because she had always understood that a woman's survival depends on appearing unbothered. She went to lunch with friends who would be careful with their words. She smiled at women who were already deciding whether they would have to cut her later. She received a call from Edward and felt the whole air around her shift, because that was what his voice did now. It rearranged her. He asked where she was, what she had eaten, who had been there, as if he were gathering details to build a world that included him. He spoke with the tenderness of a man who believes he is saving someone, and with the entitlement of a man who believes he owns the rescue. "Come to Fort this evening," he said. Fort Belvedere, spoken like a private chapel. Wallis hesitated. She could almost hear earnest, quiet anger in her own ears. She could almost feel the eyes of London on her back. But she said yes, because saying no had begun to feel like stepping into a cold room alone. At Fort Belvedere, Edward did not greet her like a prince greeting a guest. He greeted her like a starving man greeting dinner. He took her hands, pulled her inside, and began talking before her coat was off. The moment she arrived, his mood lifted. The staff noticed, of course. The staff always noticed. People who serve royalty become experts in invisible weather. He showed her something new he had bought, a trinket, a painting, a piece of furniture. He asked her opinion as if he could not trust his own taste. He told her about a conversation with his father that had gone badly, and he spoke with the petulance of a man who had been scolded and wanted comfort, and with the bitterness of a man who felt he had been scolded his entire life. "They treat me like a child," he said. Wallis sat down, crossed her legs and watched him pace. In another life she might have found it absurd. A grown man, heir to an empire, complaining about being treated like a child. But Edward did feel like a child in certain ways. He had been raised in a household where love was rationed and praise was rare. He had been taught to perform, not to be, and he had never learned how to tolerate frustration without turning it into drama. Wallis reached for his hand and squeezed. She did it with exactly the right pressure, as if she had measured his need. "You're not a child," she said. "You are simply surrounded by people who need you to behave like one." He stared at her as if she had given him a gift. Then with a sudden softness he said, "Promise you will not leave me." It was an unreasonable request, the kind that should make a sensible woman laugh and step away. Wallis did not laugh. She felt something in her tighten, a strange mix of triumph and irritation. She liked being needed, but she hated being asked to become a guarantee. "I am here," she said instead, which was not a promise, but sounded like one. Edward kissed her hand. He looked at her with the kind of devotion that becomes dangerous because it does not allow the other person to be ordinary. He had begun to turn Wallis into a solution to his unhappiness. He had begun to treat her like a medicine. Medicines come with dosages, and Edward did not believe in dosages. After that night, the talk of Ernest became more direct. Edward would ask, casually at first, whether Ernest was difficult, whether he understood, whether he could be persuaded to be reasonable. Edward used the word reasonable the way powerful men do, meaning cooperative. Wallis would brush it away. "Ernest is not a monster," she said. "He's simply married to me." Edward did not laugh. He was not in the mood for jokes about this. He wanted a clear path. Wallis knew the path was not clear. Divorce, in their world, was not just paperwork. It was a performance, a public narrative. You could not simply say, "We have grown apart." You had to provide a reason that fit the accepted script. It was ugly, humiliating, and full of strangers asking questions about your private life. And for a woman like Wallis, already under suspicion, it would be a feast for people who disliked her. Still, the idea began to take shape, not as romance, not as a fairy tale, but as a plan. Wallis had always been better at plans than dreams. She spoke to friends who knew lawyers, friends who knew how to arrange things quietly. She began to understand which details mattered and which could be managed. It was not that she was eager to drag Ernest through mud. It was that she was practical enough to know the system required mud. The system demanded a villain and a victim, and a reason that sounded respectable. And in that system, the woman was almost always cast as the problem. Sometimes, when she was alone, Wallis would look at herself in a mirror and study her own face as if she were a stranger. She had built this face, this calm, this polish, this certainty. But beneath it, there was a woman who could still feel the sting of being called not quite good enough. She had never been fully accepted in Baltimore because she had been too hungry. She would never be fully accepted in London because she was too visible. She was not the right. If she went forward, she would be punished. If she went backward, she would be punished too, only in a quieter way, with regret and a smaller life. So she kept walking forward. Kind of woman, meaning she refused to shrink. Kind of American, meaning she was not grateful enough. She was not the right. In society, the atmosphere around her thickened. Even the people who still invited her began to do it with a careful air, like they were handling a vase they feared might crack. Some friends became theatrical in their loyalty, greeting her loudly in public, making sure others saw. They wanted to be on the winning side. Others began to act as if they barely knew her, turning their heads with a look of mild confusion, as if Wallis were a woman they had once met at a dull dinner and forgotten. One hostess, a woman who had always been cool to Wallis, offered her a compliment that sounded sweet until you tasted it. "You have such courage," she said, eyes bright. "I could never do what you do." Wallis smiled. "Then you are fortunate." It was the sort of exchange that kept London alive, little daggers in velvet. Afterward, the hostess told a friend that Wallis had been insolent. The friend told another that Wallis was cruel. By morning, someone was repeating that Wallis had insulted a duchess. It was never the exact words that mattered. It was the mood. The mood was turning. There were also quieter whispers, the kind that travelled through men who had access to files and telephones. People said the government had begun to take an interest. People said there were concerns about who Wallis knew, about her friends, about her dinners, about the men who appeared in her orbit. There were always men in her orbit. London was full of men who liked a clever woman and then resented her for being cleverer than they expected. Some of the whispers were pure malice, some were genuine alarm. A future king attached to a woman who was divorced, foreign, and socially polarizing was already enough trouble. Add the faint suggestion of questionable friends, and the trouble stopped being merely moral. It became political, which is when men in suits begin to hold meetings. Edward, of course, hated meetings about his private life. When he sensed that people were discussing Wallis as a problem, his devotion sharpened into defiance. He began to speak of her as if she were being attacked unfairly, which she was, and as if any criticism of her was an insult to him, which it was, and as if he would rather burn everything than allow them to take her away. He started to spend less time with the court and more time at Fort Belvedere. He started to withdraw from the people who had known him longest and lean harder on the circle Wallis brought with her. That circle was witty, glamorous, and not always wise. They drank, they laughed, they played games that turned cruel when someone grew bored. They were the sort of people who treated the prince as Edward when it suited them, and as the prince when they wanted a favour. Edward, starved for normalcy, did not always see the difference. Wallis saw it. She also saw that she was becoming responsible for keeping the atmosphere pleasant, because Edward depended on pleasantness the way some men depend on applause. If the room felt tense, he would become irritable. If someone slighted him, he would sulk. If someone questioned Wallis, he would flare. He was not emotionally sturdy. He was emotionally dramatic. Wallis, with her coolness, could guide him. But guiding a man who believes he is finally free is like guiding a horse that has just seen an open gate. At one gathering, after too many drinks and too much laughter, Edward began to talk about the future with a kind of reckless certainty. He spoke about being king as if it were a formality he could get through quickly. He spoke about Wallis as if she were already his public companion, not merely his private obsession. A friend, tipsy and careless, said something like, "You will have to marry the right sort of girl, you know." Edward looked at Wallis, then back at the friend, and said, "I already have the right sort of girl." The room went quiet in that way that makes your skin prickle. Someone laughed too loudly. Someone changed the subject. Wallis kept her face smooth, but inside, she felt the floor tilt. Edward did not understand, or did not care, what that kind of statement meant in the wrong ears. It meant he was no longer playing. It meant he was declaring. Afterwards, Wallis scolded him gently, the way you scold a man who could ruin you with his sincerity. "You cannot say things like that," she told him. "You make it impossible." He looked wounded. "Why should I pretend?" he said. "Why should we hide?" Because the country was not theirs to rearrange, because the crown was not an accessory, because a king does not simply marry whomever he likes without the whole structure of England trembling. Wallis knew all that, and yet she did not say it fully because saying it would make it real. She said because people are unkind. He pulled her close. "Then we will not care what they think." It was an easy vow for him to make. He had never had to care about money, about security, about being shut out. Wallis had. She cared very much what people thought, not because she was weak, but because she understood that public opinion is a kind of weather. You can pretend it does not exist, but it can still drown you. The king, George V, was fading. That was another weather system, quieter but heavy. He had been on the throne for decades, stern, dutiful, respected. He had seen the empire through war and upheaval, and he believed, with the grim certainty of his generation, that survival depended on discipline. As his health declined, the court grew more cautious, more anxious. In uncertain times, people cling harder to rules. Edward, meanwhile, seemed to treat his father's illness as both a tragedy and a nuisance. He would express concern, then complain about being summoned to Sandringham or Buckingham Palace for grim family gatherings where everyone spoke in hushed tones and expected him to look solemn. He wanted to be at Fort. He wanted to be with Wallis. He wanted to pretend the world was not shifting under his feet. Wallis watched his discomfort with a mixture of sympathy and disbelief. She had no affection for Edward's parents, whom she had barely encountered and could not charm even if she did. But she understood that a man losing his father is not a man at his best, and Edward was already not at his best. He clung to Wallis more, not less, and his need began to feel less like romance and more like dependency. There is a particular kind of pressure that comes from being treated as someone's salvation. It sounds flattering until you realize you are now responsible for someone breathing. Wallis began to feel it. She began to feel that if she withdrew, Edward would collapse into rage or despair. She began to feel that his love was not merely affection. It was a demand for stability he did not have inside himself. In those months, she also began to show more of her sharpness in public, perhaps because she was tired, perhaps because she was angry, perhaps because she sensed she was being judged no matter what. Servants began to complain quietly that she could be cutting. A maid might be dismissed with a phrase that stung. A footman might be corrected with an impatience that seemed excessive. In a world where servants had ears and loyalty to their employers, that mattered. Those stories travelled upward, polished into moral tales. She is rude to staff, people would say, as if rudeness were proof of wickedness. Sometimes it was rudeness. Sometimes it was simply a woman used to American directness in a British world that preferred to wound with smiles. But perception was hardening. Every sharp moment became evidence. Every cool response became proof that she had no heart. The nastiest rumour of all was that she mocked the royal family. There were stories that she called the Queen Mother, then the Duchess of York, by unkind names, that she mimicked the way courtiers bowed and scraped, that she laughed at the rituals of the court. Some of these stories were invented. Some were likely exaggerated. Wallis did enjoy a cruel joke when she thought she was among friends. She had spent years watching the English worship tradition, and she found the worship both fascinating and ridiculous. The trouble was that Edward was not allowed to find it ridiculous. He was the living symbol of it. When Wallis mocked it and Edward laughed, it felt to others like treason in a drawing room. Word reached the people who mattered. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, was not a man who delighted in drama. He was cautious, managerial, and deeply aware that the monarchy needed public trust. Baldwin had no interest in telling a prince whom to love, but he did have interest in preventing a constitutional crisis, and that meant he began to watch Edward with the patient attention of someone waiting for a child to stop misbehaving. The Church watched too. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Lang, represented a moral authority that in those days still carried weight. The king was not just a political figure, he was also the head of the Church of England. The idea of that man marrying a twice-divorced woman with living former husbands was not merely distasteful to church leaders. It was, to them, a direct challenge to the institution itself. Wallis did not spend her evenings thinking about bishops, but bishops would soon spend their evenings thinking about her. In the meantime, Wallis moved closer to the centre of Edward life. She began to be present for more private moments, more intimate rituals. She would arrive at fort and find his clothes laid out for her opinion. She would sit with him while he read reports he disliked. She would soothe him after quarrels with his father. She would advise him, and he would absorb her advice as if it were scripture. To the court, this was terrifying. Not because Wallis was uniquely evil, but because she was uniquely close. Mistresses could be tolerated if they stayed in their lane. Wallis was stepping into the lane where influence lived. There were attempts to stop it. Older friends of the prince, men who had known him since youth, tried to talk to him in that careful tone men use when they think another man is being foolish. They suggested that he was risking too much. They hinted that Wallis might not be loyal. They hinted that she might be using him. Edward responded badly. He would flare, accuse them of jealousy, accuse them of not wanting him to be happy. He would then withdraw from them, cutting them off with the brutality of someone who believes he is protecting his love. Wallis observed these fractures with a cool eye. She did not always like Edward old friends. Some were snobs, some were dull, some were rude to her. But she understood something important. Edward was isolating himself, and isolation makes people reckless. A man who feels surrounded by enemies stops listening. That is how mistakes become catastrophes. She tried occasionally to push him back towards caution. She would suggest that he attend certain engagements, that he make certain appearances, that he be seen doing the dutiful things. Edward would agree in the moment, then drift back toward his obsession. Wallis began to realize that she had influence, but not control. Influence can coax, it cannot command. At home, Ernest grew more distant. The house that had once been their shared stage began to feel like a set for a play that had ended. There were awkward meals, polite exchanges, long silences. Ernest travelled. Wallis travelled. They avoided each other and called it civility. One evening, Ernest finally spoke with more directness. "If you insist on continuing this," he said, "then you must understand what it does to me." Wallis looked at him and felt briefly a sting of something like guilt. Ernest had not been cruel. He had not beaten her. He had not humiliated her in public. He had given her a respectable life, and she was preparing to tear it apart because a prince wanted her. "You're not innocent in this," she said, because Wallis did not know how to be the villain quietly. "You married me knowing what I was." Ernest's eyes narrowed. "I married you believing you had limits." Wallis could not answer that, because she did have limits, but they were not the limits Ernest meant. Her limit was never again being trapped. Her limit was never again being powerless. Her limit was never again letting other people decide her value. Edward, with all his neediness and devotion, was offering her a strange form of power. It was power wrapped in risk, but it was still power. As the year moved on, the foreign press began to sniff. British newspapers remained mostly restrained, obedient to that unspoken agreement to protect the crown. But abroad, the story was too delicious. An American divorcee and the heir to the British throne. It was romance, scandal, empire, sex, everything a headline loves. Quiet mentions began to appear in European papers, then in American ones. Wealthy Americans visiting London began to whisper at home, "Have you heard about the prince and that woman?" The stories spread like smoke, first faint, then unavoidable. Edward seemed oblivious, or perhaps he chose to be. Wallis was not oblivious. She began to feel the walls closing. Once the story escaped into the wider world, it could not be stuffed back into London drawing rooms. It would become public. And once it became public, the rules would change. One afternoon, a friend warned Wallis that certain people at court were actively looking for ways to remove her from Edward influence. Not with violence, not with some melodramatic scheme, but with pressure. Invitations could be blocked. Access could be restricted. Edward could be surrounded by loyal staff who kept her away. The king could order him. The government could warn him. It was all very civilized. It was also very real. Wallis listened, then said, "They will try." "Yes," the friend said, "and they might succeed." Wallis smiled, small and tight. "Then they do not understand him." That was the point. They did not understand him, not emotionally. They understood the crown. They understood the rules. They did not understand the boyish stubbornness of a man who had spent his whole life feeling controlled. Edward was not a man who responded well to being told what to do. The more they pushed, the more he would cling. If they tried to take Wallis away, he would treat it like proof that she was his true ally against them. Wallis could see that, and she could also see the danger that came with it. If Edward framed this as war, then she would be his weapon and his excuse. And weapons are not loved gently, they are used. In one of their quieter moments, Wallis finally spoke more honestly than she usually allowed. "You cannot have everything," she told him. "You cannot have me and also keep the world calm." Edward held her face in his hands. "I will have you," he said, and his voice was not romantic. It was resolved. "Whatever it costs." Whatever it costs, that sounded grand when a man says it. It sounds less grand when you realize the cost will be paid by other people too. By Ernest being publicly humiliated. By the monarchy being shaken. By the nation being dragged into a moral argument. By Wallis being turned into a symbol and then punished for it. Wallis did not say that. She simply looked at Edward and felt, with a cold clarity, that they were no longer drifting. They were heading somewhere, and the direction was not gentle. As the King health worsened, the atmosphere around the family grew heavier. Conversations became clipped, smiles became strained. The palace felt like a house waiting for a death. Edward, instead of sinking into duty, fled more often to Fort Belvedere, and Wallis became, in effect, his private queen. The phrase would have horrified the people who guarded tradition. But in those rooms, with the curtains drawn and the servants stepping softly, it was already true. Wallis chose the guests. Wallis decided what was served. Wallis decided whether Edward would be soothed or stirred. Edward, the heir to the throne, waited for her mood. It was intoxicating for him. It was hazardous for her. And it was unforgivable to the people who believed the monarchy must never look like it can be led by a woman who was not born into obedience. The final insult for many was that Wallis did not seem humbled by what she was doing. She did not speak like a woman terrified of scandal. She spoke like a woman who expected the world to accommodate her. That expectation, in a society that demanded women apologize for their ambition, felt like insolence. By the time winter pressed in, London had reached a strange point. Everyone knew. Everyone pretended they did not. Everyone watched Edward and Wallis as if they were characters in a play whose ending had not been written, except the ending was being written in real time, in the fragile health of an old king and the stubborn heart of a younger one. Wallis could feel the moment approaching, the moment when the private story would become a public one. She could feel the shift in the air when she walked into certain rooms. She could hear the careful pauses after her name. She could sense that even people who enjoyed her company were beginning to plan their own escape routes. She went home one evening and found Ernest packing for a trip. He did not look up as he folded. He spoke without turning. "I am going away for a while," he said. Wallis leaned against the doorframe and watched him. "To where?" "Anywhere. I will not be laughed at," he said. And the bitterness in his voice was sharper than anything he had said before. For a moment, Wallis felt anger flare. How dare he make her the villain when she had given him years of style and companionship? How dare he act as if he were the only one suffering? Then the anger faded and left behind a kind of emptiness. Ernest was right about one thing. People were laughing, maybe not loudly, but they were laughing. They were laughing at him, and they were laughing at her, and they were laughing at Edward too, because nothing is more entertaining than a powerful man behaving foolishly. When Ernest left, the house felt quieter, and that quiet did not feel like freedom. It felt like a door closing. Wallis went to Fort Belvedere the next day and told Edward lightly that Ernest was away. Edward reacted with the eagerness of a man hearing that an obstacle had moved. "Then we can begin," he said. Wallis asked, "Begin what?" He looked at her as if she were the one being slow now. "Our life," he said. Wallis smiled, because smiling was her armour, and because she was suddenly frightened. Not of Edward love, of Edward's certainty. Certainty is what turns a scandal into a crisis. She sat with him that afternoon, listening to him talk about plans he did not yet have the right to make, and she realised, with a clarity that made her almost dizzy, that the next change in their story would not come from her or Ernest, or even Edward's stubborn heart. It would come from the throne itself. Because the old king was dying, and when he died, Edward would no longer be a prince playing at rebellion. He would be a king, and once he was a king, the whole country would have to decide what to do with the woman who had already become, in everything but title, his chosen companion. Wallis looked out the window at the winter trees, bare and rigid, and wondered, not for the first time, whether she was walking toward a crown or toward a. The winter did not wait for anyone's feelings. It settled over the palaces with the same certainty it settled over the parks, and inside those grand rooms, the air began to smell faintly of medicine and old paper. The king was failing, not dramatically, not with shouting and scenes, but with that slow narrowing that happens when a man has spent his life gripping everything tightly and the body finally loosens its hold. When the call came, it was not dressed in poetry. It was practical, clipped, urgent. Edward was summoned, and for once even he could not pretend it was an inconvenience. He went, of course. He sat by the bed. He listened to the murmured instructions and the prayers and the gentle lying that families tell themselves at the end, that the person will rally, that tomorrow will be better. George V did not rally. He died with the weight of a reign behind him and the weight of a nation pressing forward, already wondering what kind of king would follow. Edward did not cry in the way the public imagines princes cry. He became very still. He looked pale, and for a moment you could see the boy under the polish, the boy who had never been allowed to be sloppy with emotion. His mother, Queen Mary, was composed in that frightening way she had always been, as if grief were another duty to perform correctly. There were family members around them, brothers and sisters and in-laws, all moving with careful solemnity, as if the wrong step might crack the floor. Edward did what was expected. He spoke the right words. He stood where he was placed. He let the machinery of death and succession click into motion around him. And then, because he was Edward, he did the one thing that made everyone's stomach tighten. As soon as he could, he reached for the telephone. He called Wallis. She was not at the palace. She was not among the mourners, not among the relatives, not among the people who belonged to that world by blood and obligation. She was elsewhere in her own rooms, her own life, suddenly feeling the cold consequence of what was happening. A king was dead. A new king had arrived. The invisible line she had been sensing was now a wall, and Edward was on one side of it with a crown coming down toward his head. When she heard his voice, she did not coo or gasp. She simply listened. Edward spoke to her with a rawness that he did not show to the people around him. He told her it had happened. He told her he felt strangled. He told her he could not bear the idea of stepping into that role without her. Wallis said the appropriate things. She said she was sorry. She said he must be brave. She said he must do what was required. But the words that mattered were the ones underneath, the ones she did not say. I am not part of this. I am the secret that cannot be mentioned in those rooms. I am the thing they will never let you carry into the light. Edward did not want to hear that. Edward had never wanted to hear the limits of his own life. Now he had a new title, and with it a new stubbornness. If anyone suggested limits, he treated it like a personal insult. The accession council came, the formal recognition of the new king, full of men in dark suits and centuries of habit. Edward went through it with a sort of tense impatience. He did not like ritual. He had never liked ritual. But he understood, at least intellectually, that ritual was the glue. It was how the monarchy looked stable when everything inside it was human and fragile. He also understood something else, and it made him furious. The ritual did not include Wallis. In the days after George V's death, London became a city wrapped in black cloth and quiet gossip. The newspapers printed respectful tributes, crowds gathered, churches filled. People spoke about duty and continuity and the dignity of the late king. And in drawing rooms over tea and cigarettes, women began to whisper a different question. Now what? Now what? Not for the empire, not for the world, but for the king and his American woman. Wallis felt the shift immediately. When she went out, people stared in a way they had not stared before. Not openly, not rudely, but with that focused curiosity that makes you feel like you are walking under a lamp. Men looked too long. Women looked away too fast. Friends who had been breezy became careful. Even her loyal circle seemed to speak in softer voices, as if the walls had grown ears. Ernest was still legally her husband, which mattered now in a way it had not mattered when Edward was only a prince. A prince could be indulgent. A king was tied to rules that other men did not have to consider, and the rule that sat like a stone in the middle of everything was simple in human terms. The Church of England did not accept remarriage after divorce if a former spouse was still living. Wallis had one living former husband already. If she divorced Ernest, she would have two. If Edward married her, he would be the head of a church whose leaders would have to look at that marriage and either bless it or condemn it. Edward, characteristically, reacted to this not with compromise, but with offence. He called the rule outdated. He called the bishops hypocrites. He called the whole thing ridiculous. And he did it with the confidence of a man who had never been told to sit down and listen. When advisers tried to speak gently about public opinion, Edward snapped that public opinion would follow him. Public opinion does not follow anyone forever. Public opinion follows a story that makes sense. And the story of a king marrying a twice-divorced American was not, to many people, a comforting story. Queen Mary watched her son with a kind of controlled horror. She had always known Edward was restless. She had always known he disliked being managed. But she had believed the crown would settle him, that responsibility would sober him. Instead, the crown seemed to make him more reckless because now he could interpret every objection as treason. She did not meet Wallis, not properly, not with the kind of encounter people later imagined. The Queen Mother towering in judgment while Wallis offered a daring smile. The truth was colder and more suffocating. Queen Mary simply refused to bring her into the royal family. In that refusal, Wallis could hear a sentence without words. You will never be one of us. You will never be acceptable. You will never be forgiven. Edward brothers also watched, and their watching carried its own tension. The Duke of York, Albert, known within the family as Bertie, was the opposite of Edward in temperament. Shy, conscientious, anxious, a man who tried hard and suffered for it. His stammer made public speaking painful. The idea of being king frightened him. Edward had always treated Bertie with a mixture of affection and impatience, like an older brother who finds the younger one a little too delicate. Now Bertie looked at Edward and saw something terrifying. He saw a man about to drag the monarchy into chaos for a woman the family considered unacceptable. Bertie did not want the throne, but he wanted stability even more. His wife Elizabeth, the Duchess of York, was warm and charming in public and steel underneath. She adored her husband, and she adored the institution that protected him. To her, Wallis was not a romantic figure. Wallis was a threat. Wallis, with her sharp eye, could sense which members of the family would despise her most. She could also sense something she would never say aloud. If Edward ruined himself, the crown would fall to Bertie, and Bertie would never forgive her for that burden. In the first weeks of his reign, Edward tried to do what he had always promised he would do. He tried to modernise, to shake off stiffness, to behave like a king who understood ordinary people. He visited poor neighbourhoods. He spoke about unemployment. He looked sincere, and in those moments he was sincere. He did care about suffering. He simply did not have the discipline to carry duty when duty required him to sacrifice his own wants. Behind the scenes, Edward began to treat Wallis as if she were already his partner. He wanted her at Fort Belvedere constantly. He wanted her opinion on everything. He wanted her presence to steady him, and he also wanted to show her off, to make the world see what he had chosen. That desire to show her off was the most dangerous part. It was one thing for society to whisper. It was another for the king to behave as if the whispering should stop simply because he was tired of it. Wallis, for her part, tried to tighten her control over the impression she made. She dressed with careful taste. She spoke with more restraint in certain rooms. She made an effort not to slice people with her humour, at least not within hearing distance of those who would repeat it. But she could not entirely soften herself. She had never been a naturally warm woman. She was a woman who had built warmth as a tool, not as a default. When she was tired or irritated, the tool slipped, and in those days she was often tired. Edward's moods were a constant. One moment he was radiant, planning a future where they could live freely. The next he was furious, convinced everyone was plotting against him. He could be sweet, he could be childish, he could be stubborn in a way that felt almost adolescent. Wallis learned to soothe him, to distract him, to flatter him back into calm. She also learned quietly that she had become responsible for his emotional temperature. When you become responsible for a man's emotional temperature, you begin to feel less like a lover and more like a nurse. Ernest returned briefly from his escape, not because he wanted to resume the marriage, but because life demanded decisions. He and Wallis sat down at a table like business partners who had once been affectionate. Their conversation was polite and grim. "What do you want?" Ernest asked, and his voice carried no romance, only weariness. Wallis looked at him and considered her own answer. She did not want to be married to Ernest. She did not want to be humiliated by divorce court either. She did not want to be trapped in a scandal without a solution. She wanted a way through. "I want peace," she said, which was not entirely true. Ernest gave a small, humorless laugh. "You have chosen a strange path to peace." Wallis' eyes hardened. "I did not choose the king falling in love with me." Ernest leaned back. "You stayed. That is a choice." There it was, laid out. Not the romance, not the destiny, not the melodrama. The simple fact that she had stayed. Wallis did not deny it. She had stayed. And now the only path forward was through the mess. Divorce began to be discussed more seriously, with lawyers, with friends, with careful planning. In those days, divorce required a narrative the court would accept. It required someone to be at fault. It required a public reason. The whole process was designed to make people ashamed enough not to do it. Wallis was not easily shamed, but she understood the danger of being forced into a courtroom story while the entire nation watched her. She also understood that if she was to be divorced, it needed to look orderly, not like the frantic scramble of a woman trying to catch a crown. Edward wanted speed. He wanted it done yesterday. Wallis wanted caution. She wanted to move in a way that gave her some protection, some dignity, some control. Their difference in tempo became a new kind of friction. Edward interpreted hesitation as rejection. Wallis interpreted urgency as recklessness. One evening he accused her of not loving him enough. He said it in a voice that sounded wounded and angry at once, like a man who believes he has sacrificed everything and wants applause for it. Wallis looked at him and felt a flash of irritation, so sharp. It almost made her laugh. "You are a king," she said. "You have not sacrificed everything. You have barely begun." Edward's face tightened. "Do not speak to me like a courtier," he snapped. "I am not a courtier," Wallis said, and there was the problem. He wanted her to be his refuge from the court, but he also wanted her to behave with the reverence the court expected. He wanted her to be both intimate and acceptable, both rebellious and respectable. Those were contradictions, and Edward was the kind of man who hated contradictions unless he could ignore them. As the months moved towards spring, the press situation began to fray. British newspapers continued their polite silence, but the world beyond Britain was less restrained. American papers hinted. European papers joked. People, travelling back and forth, carried the story like contraband. It became impossible to pretend the King's private life was entirely private. There were photographs too. Not in the grand official sense, but in the casual modern sense, a king glimpsed laughing with a woman, a king seen arriving at a house, a king seeming, to the observant eye, too familiar. Each image was a match struck near dry wood. The government began to take the situation more seriously. Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, was a man who understood that the monarchy survived because it stayed above messy personal drama. A king could have private flaws. The king could even have private sins. But those sins could not become a public argument that split the country. Baldwin did not rush to Edward with threats. He approached him like a man approaching a fire that could spread. He chose careful words. He used the language of responsibility and stability and national interest. Edward listened with a stiff politeness that barely covered his impatience. Then Edward did what he always did when he felt trapped. He spoke of Wallis as if she were non-negotiable. Baldwin, who was not easily rattled, began to realise something grim. Edward was not looking for advice. Edward was looking for permission, and Baldwin could not give it. The church leaders also began to murmur. The Archbishop of Canterbury was not the sort of man who enjoyed scandal, but he could not ignore the moral and institutional issue. The king was the head of the church. A marriage the church could not bless would create an impossible contradiction at the top of the national life. Even people who did not care about religion cared about what it would mean for the monarchy to look confused and divided. Wallis listened to these warnings indirectly, through friends, through Edward angry recounting, through the thickening tension in the air. And she began to feel, perhaps for the first time, that the story might end with her being told to disappear. There were whispers of exile, though no one called it that. People talked about her going abroad for a while, for her own sake, for the king's sake, for the country's sake. They spoke as if it would be temporary. Temporary is a comforting word. It is also often a lie. Wallis did not like the idea of being sent away. She had spent too much of her life being moved around by other people's choices. She did not want to be packed up like a problem, but she also began to feel a strange exhaustion. The constant watchfulness, the constant tension, the constant performance of calm. It was wearing even her down. Edward suggested they escape for a while, not as a retreat but as a declaration. He wanted to be seen with her. He wanted the world to adjust. So they planned a trip that sounded, on paper, like a holiday. In reality, it was a gamble. They took a yacht, elegant, modern, the kind of floating luxury that looks carefree until you remember it can be photographed from a distance. The sea air suited Edward. He looked younger. He laughed more. He behaved, for a few days, like a man who believed he had beaten the world simply by sailing away. From it, Wallis sat on deck with her hair pinned back, her face angled just so, as if she understood that even on water she was being watched. She enjoyed moments of quiet, moments where the only sound was the sea and the low murmur of voices. She also felt, with a constant faint ache, that this was not a normal lover's escape. This was a king in love, and the world would not let him have a normal escape. The yacht moved along the coast. They visited ports. They met glamorous companions. They drank and talked late into the night. Edward was attentive in a way that could be sweet and suffocating. He would look at Wallis as if she were a miracle he had wrestled from the universe. He would touch her hand as if to reassure himself she was still there. Wallis, who liked control, tried to keep the mood light. She teased him. She scolded him gently when he became too intense. She played hostess because hostessing was her most reliable form of authority. But even she could not control what happened beyond the yacht rail. Photographers did what photographers do. Foreign reporters wrote what foreign reporters wanted. The images travelled. A king, smiling, relaxed, visibly devoted to a married woman. It was the kind of visual that can undo months of polite silence. When Edward and Wallis returned, London felt different. The air had changed. People who had pretended not to know now knew loudly in their own minds. The story could no longer be confined to whispered jokes. It had been given a stage. Wallis sensed the shift the moment her car turned into a familiar street, and she saw how people looked. Not everyone looked. Some looked away, as if looking would make them complicit. Some stared, hungry and disapproving at once. Wallis kept her chin level. She had survived worse stares than this, but she also knew, with a cold certainty, that something had moved from gossip to inevitability. Edward returned to his duties with a kind of forced normality, but he was more irritated than before. He resented the whispers. He resented Baldwin's careful conversations. He resented his mother's disapproval. He resented the church murmurs. He resented the fact that the country did not simply cheer his love story the way a crowd cheers a movie ending. Wallis became, in his mind, both his comfort and his cause. He spoke about marrying her with increasing bluntness, as if bluntness could flatten obstacles. He began to talk about solutions that sounded clever to him and impossible to everyone else. One idea floated, whispered, tested, then dismissed, then floated again. A special kind of marriage, one that would allow him to marry Wallis without making her queen. A compromise that sounded neat on paper and felt humiliating in practice. It would mean Edward could have her, but she would never have his title. She would remain outside the sacred circle, a wife without the dignity the crown would normally give. Some people thought it was a reasonable compromise. Others thought it was worse, because it would make the monarchy look like it was inventing rules for. One man, personal appetite. Wallis herself reacted with a mixture of offence and relief. Offence, because she did not like being offered a half place. Relief, because the idea suggested that perhaps she could be married without being swallowed entirely by royal expectation. Edward hated the compromise. Edward did not like half measures. He wanted the full thing, the public declaration, the legitimacy, the satisfaction of making the world accept what he had chosen. Wallis watched him push and push, and she began to fear that his stubbornness would end not with a wedding, but with a rupture. She had known reckless men. She had been married to one. Edward's recklessness was dressed in velvet, but it was still recklessness. The people around her began to change as well. Some friends grew more attentive, more flattering, more eager to be near her, as if they could smell the possibility of history. Others drifted away quietly, as if saving themselves from infection. Even within her own circle there were little betrayals, small leaks, private remarks repeated in the wrong place. Wallis began to feel the loneliness that comes from being at the centre of a storm. Everyone is looking at you, and very few are truly with you. Ernest, watching from the edge of his own ruined marriage, became more practical. He agreed to move forward with divorce proceedings, not out of kindness, but because his own life needed an ending too. He wanted an orderly settlement. He wanted his own dignity. He wanted to stop being the polite husband in a public humiliation. Wallis understood. She did not beg him for forgiveness. She did not plead. She simply arranged the next steps with the same careful focus she used when placing a table setting. In private moments, when no one was watching, she sometimes allowed herself to feel something like grief for the normal life she had destroyed. Not because she missed earnest love, if it had ever been love in the tender sense, but because she missed the anonymity of being a woman with ordinary problems. She missed being able to walk into a room and be judged only by the cut of her dress, not by the fate of a monarchy. Then Edward would call, his voice eager and urgent, and the grief would be swept away by the relentless demand of his feelings. One afternoon, after another tense conversation with Baldwin, Edward arrived at Fort Belvedere with his nerves stretched tight. He paced. He swore. He spoke about the government as if it were a personal enemy. He spoke about his mother as if she had betrayed him. He spoke about bishops as if they were cartoon villains. Wallis sat, watching him, and for a moment she saw him with startling clarity. Not as a king, not as a lover, not as a romantic hero, as a man who had never learned how to tolerate frustration without turning it into a drama where he was the wounded star. She said quietly, "You cannot fight everyone." Edward stopped pacing and looked at her. "I can," he said, "if you are with me." There it was again, the weight. Be with me, save me. Make this worth it. It was not fair, and Edward was not thinking about fairness. He was thinking about his own hunger. Wallis felt a sudden flash of anger, not at him exactly, but at the situation, at the crown, at the country, at the fact that she had become the place where all these forces collided. She had wanted control, and now she was being asked to hold up something enormous with her own two hands. She softened her voice because she knew when to. "I am with you," she said, and she meant it in the only way she could mean it. She was with him as far as she could go. Whether she could go all the way to the end, she did not yet know. Outside their private rooms, the pressure continued to build. The government watched, the church watched, the royal family watched. The public, still largely shielded by the British press restraint, began to sense there was a story being kept from them, which made them more curious. The foreign press continued to print and laugh and speculate, and those clippings found their way into British hands, passed around with a mix of embarrassment and fascination. Wallis began to understand that Britain did not like being made to feel foolish. Britain could tolerate many things, but it hated the sense that it was being tricked, that the king life was being lived openly in one place and hidden in another. When the truth finally came out, the anger would not be only about morality, it would be about pride. She also began to understand that some of the people closest to Edward were looking at her with something more than dislike. They were looking at her as if she were an invading force. They spoke of tradition. They spoke of stability. They spoke of the crown. But underneath it all was a more personal fear. If Edward could choose her, then the old rules could be broken. And if the old rules could be broken, then the whole hierarchy that kept certain people important could wobble. That kind of fear does not make people polite. It makes them ruthless. Wallis started to receive advice that sounded like concern and felt like pressure. Friends suggested she keep a lower profile. People hinted she should take a trip abroad. Some said it would help Edward, make him look less reckless. Some said it would calm the king critics. Some said it would give everyone time to think. Wallis heard what they were really saying. Leave. Give us room to handle him. Give us a chance to pull him back without you in the way. She did not want to leave, but she also began to sense that staying might become dangerous in a different way. Not physically, though London was full of strangers who could spit a nasty word. Dangerous socially, politically, emotionally. A woman can endure gossip, but she cannot endure being turned into a national crisis without feeling it in her bones. Edward, when she mentioned the idea, reacted badly. They want to separate us, he said, and his eyes flashed with that familiar mix of fear and fury. They want to calm things, Wallis said. They want to control me, Edward snapped. Wallis did not argue because arguing would only push him into stubbornness. Instead, she said, "Let me go for a little while. It will give you room to speak to them." Edward looked at her as if she had suggested a kind of betrayal. "You're leaving me." "I'm trying to keep you," she said, and the sentence surprised even her because it was true. Edward sat heavily, suddenly looking younger and more lost. He reached for her hand. "Promise you will come back," he said. Wallis did not promise. She had learned not to promise what she could not guarantee. Instead, she kissed his fingers and said, "Of course." Of course is a lovely word. It sounds like certainty. It can also be a soft lie. The decision began to form, not with a dramatic announcement, but with quiet arrangements, a trip, a change of scenery, a way to let the heat cool without letting the bond break. Wallis packed in a way that suggested she was travelling, not fleeing. She chose clothes that could travel well. She chose jewellery that could be worn without comment. She kept her face calm, because calm was her best defence. On the night before she left, she and Edward sat together in a room at Fort Belvedere that felt, for once, almost quiet. Edward was not shouting about Baldwin. He was not raging about bishops. He was simply watching her as if memorising. "I cannot do this without you," he said. Wallis, for all her sharpness, felt her throat tighten. She was not made of ice. She had simply learned to behave as if she were. "You have done everything without me," she said softly. "You were born into it." Edward shook his head. "I was born into duty," he said. "I was not born into happiness." Wallis could have said something wise about happiness being a foolish thing to chase when you are a king. She could have said something practical about the country being larger than his feelings. She could have said a dozen sensible things. Instead, she placed her hand over his and said, "Then be careful with it." Edward pulled her close, and for a moment the world narrowed to their shared breath, their shared tension, the strange intimacy of two people who had made a choice and now had to live inside its consequences. When Wallis finally left, she did not look back in a dramatic way. She walked to the car, lifted her chin and moved forward. But inside she felt something that was not quite regret and not quite relief. It was the awareness that she had stepped into a story that no longer belonged only to her and Edward. It belonged to Britain now, and Britain did not forgive easily. As the car carried her away, Edward stood in the doorway of Fort Belvedere, watching until the road curved and she was gone. And in that silent watching was a warning, even if he did not understand it yet. A king who cannot bear separation is a king who will do something desperate when the separation becomes permanent. Wallis pressed her gloved hands together in her lap and stared out at the grey countryside, and for the first time she allowed herself to think the thought she had been avoiding. If they can't accept me, what will he do? Wallis did not go far enough to feel anonymous. There is a special kind of anonymity that exists only when nobody cares where you are. Wallis had never had that kind. Even on foreign soil, with different newspapers on the breakfast tray and different accents in the hotel corridors, she could feel the eyes. In some ways, the eyes were worse abroad, because foreigners had none of Britain's stiff restraint. They stared the way people stare at a woman who has become a headline. She chose France because France understood scandal the way Britain understood rules. In France, a clever woman with a complicated love life was not automatically treated like a moral infection. She could walk into a room and be appraised for her dress, her wit, her company, not only for her sins. That alone was a relief, but it was not peace. Peace requires distance from the story, and the story followed her like a scent. She stayed in hotels where the staff were trained not to blink, the sort of places where a woman can be famous and still be served coffee as if she is merely another guest. On the surface, her days looked almost pleasant. Lunch on a terrace, a drive along the coast, an evening drink with friends who were glamorous enough to make danger feel like entertainment. But inside, she was watching the calendar the way anxious people watch a clock. Each day she was away from Edward was supposed to calm him. Instead, she could feel his hunger building through his letters and calls. He wrote constantly. When he could not write, he telephoned. When he could not telephone, he sent messages through friends. Each note carried the same undercurrent. Do not forget me. Do not leave me. Do not let them win. He used the word they often. He rarely specified who they were because he did not need to. They was the court, the government, the bishops, his family, the invisible hand that had directed his life since birth. Wallis read his letters in the early morning when the light was soft and her nerves were still quiet. She could be touched by his devotion. She could also feel trapped by it. There was a difference between being loved and being clung to, and Edward had a talent for turning love into something adhesive. She wrote back carefully. She told him she missed him, because that was safe. She told him he must be patient, because that was necessary. She told him to listen to Baldwin, because that was wise, and then she softened it with a compliment, because Edward could not tolerate feeling corrected. She was managing him from across a channel, which would have been impressive if it had not been exhausting. The newspapers abroad were no help. They wrote about her with the bright cruelty of people who enjoy watching another country squirm. Some called her charming, some called her ruthless, some called her a social climber with a sharp mouth. The descriptions were never neutral. A woman in the middle of a royal scandal is never allowed to be merely complicated. She must be either a siren or a snake. Back in Britain, the restraint of the press was beginning to crack. It had been held together by habit and by fear, but habit can fail when the story becomes too large. Ordinary people had started to hear rumours from travellers, from foreign clippings, from the way their friends spoke in slightly lowered voices. The silence began to look less like dignity and more like concealment, and the British public, polite as it can be, does not like being treated like a child. Stanley Baldwin knew the moment was coming when the secret would no longer stay secret. He also knew something else that made the whole situation more volatile. The king himself was not discreet. Edward did not behave like a man trying to contain a problem. He behaved like a man preparing to declare victory. Baldwin had a talent for calm, which is a useful talent when a king is behaving like an angry lover. He went to Edward again, not with shouting, not with threats, but with facts delivered in a voice that sounded almost kind. The country would not accept it, he explained. The church would not accept it. The government could not support it. If Edward married Wallis as queen, ministers would resign and the monarchy would be pulled into a public fight. A king who cannot keep a government behind him becomes a king with no practical power and no public stability. Edward listened and then did what Wallis dreaded most. He treated the explanation as if it were a personal attack. "I am not a puppet," he said. Baldwin did not flinch. "No, sir," he said, which was a polite way of saying, "You are a king, not a god." Edward wanted a clever solution, something that would allow him to keep Wallis without having the country revolt. The idea of a special marriage came back, the kind where he could be married, but she would not be crowned. It sounded to Edward like an insult to the woman he loved, and he began to argue that if he could not make her queen, then the whole institution was not worth keeping. He said it with the dramatic flair of a man who believes his own feelings are a moral argument. Baldwin, again, stayed calm. He explained that even that compromise would be difficult because the issue was not only her title. The issue was the church rules and the public mood. The issue was that the king life had become a public affair and the public would have a say whether Edward liked it or not. Edward hated that. He had been adored by crowds all his life and he mistook adoration for obedience. The discussions grew larger. The monarchy in those days was tied not just to Britain, but to other parts of the Empire and Commonwealth, places that had their own governments. That meant the problem could not be solved quietly in London. The other governments would have to be consulted, because the king was their king too. In plain terms, Edward could not make a decision that shook the crown without dragging multiple countries into the argument. To Edward, it felt like people were ganging up on him. To Baldwin, it felt like the sober reality of a system that was built to prevent a single man from doing whatever he liked. Wallis heard fragments of these conversations through Edward calls, through friends who travelled, through the anxious tone of people who had once sounded breezy. She began to understand that her absence was not calming the situation. It was sharpening it, because Edward now had a longing he could turn into heroism. He could tell himself he was suffering for love. Suffering made him feel noble. Wallis did not want him to feel noble. Noble men do dramatic things. One afternoon in France, she sat with a friend on a terrace overlooking the sea. The friend was the sort of woman who had grown up around money and scandal and therefore did not gasp easily. She stirred her drink and said in a tone that sounded casual, "They say he means it. They say he will give up the crown." Wallis kept her face calm, because her face had been trained for calm. But inside, something jolted. "He would not," she said. Her friend lifted a shoulder. "Men say many things. Kings say fewer. But this one seems serious." Wallis stared out at the water and felt the world narrow to a single question she had been trying not to ask. If he cannot accept me, what will he do? Now she could hear the answer forming. He will throw the whole thing overboard. That was not romantic. That was catastrophic. She called Edward that night. She tried to sound light at first, as if she was simply checking on his mood. Edward was in one of his intense phases. He spoke quickly, urgently, as if he had been saving up words for her. He told her the government was impossible. He told her the bishops were arrogant. He told her his family were cold. He told her he was tired of pretending. Wallis listened, and then said, carefully, "You must not speak of abdication." There was a pause. The pause told her everything. He said softly, "So they have told you." Wallis felt a flush of anger, not at him alone, but at the way the story was now out of her hands. "Do not do it," she said. "Do not even threaten it. You will make them call your bluff." Edward's voice hardened. "It is not a bluff. I will not live without you." Wallis had heard dramatic men before. She had heard drunken vows, sentimental promises, threats disguised as devotion. But Edward was not drunk. He was not joking. He was a man who had never learned how to lose gracefully. "You are not the only person in this," she said, and she hated herself for how sharp it sounded. He replied, "Yes, I am. I am the king." It should have been laughable, and it was not. That was the heart of it. He believed the crown belonged to him personally, not to the nation, not to history. He believed he could pick it up and put it down like a coat. Wallis said, "You cannot do this for me." Edward said, "I will do it for myself. You are the only thing that makes it bearable." Wallis closed her eyes and felt a kind of dread settle in her chest. She had wanted control. Now she was watching a man prepare to detonate his own life and call it love. After the call, she sat very still. The hotel room was quiet. Outside, France continued to be France, indifferent and beautiful. Inside, Wallis could feel the weight of a nation moving toward her like a storm. Her friends offered advice, the way friends do when they are scared for you and also slightly thrilled by the drama. Some said she should return to England and show the king she was loyal. Some said she should stay away and let him calm down. Some suggested she should end it, leave him, save the monarchy, save herself. Ending it sounded simple, only to people who had never been loved by a man who could call ministers and move headlines. Wallis knew that if she tried to leave Edward now, he would not simply sigh and accept it. He would chase. He would plead. He might even punish her in the childish way powerful men punish women who refuse to behave as expected. And beyond Edward, the world was watching. If she left him, she would be cast as the woman who broke the king's heart. If she stayed, she would be cast as the woman who broke the monarchy. There was no version where she became the heroine. There was, however, a version where she survived. Survival began to become her primary goal. Not love, not glory, not even power. Survival. Wallis had always been good at reading a room. Now she had to read a country. The British press finally began to crack. Once a few papers hinted, others could no longer pretend. The story began to be discussed openly, sometimes with outrage, sometimes with fascination, sometimes with the weary tone of people who feel they have been dragged into someone's private mess. Letters poured into editors. Clergy muttered from pulpits. In working-class pubs and wealthy dining rooms alike, people began to debate the same question with different vocabulary. Should a king be allowed to marry a woman like that? A woman like that. The phrase did so much work. It turned Wallis into a category. It made the argument feel moral rather than personal. It allowed people to hate her without admitting their hatred was tangled with class, with nationalism, with misogyny, with the discomfort of seeing a woman refuse to bow. Wallis read foreign clippings about British reactions and felt for the first time something like genuine fear. She had always been tough, but toughness does not stop a crowd from turning you into a symbol. Symbols are crushed because they are easier to handle than human beings. In London, Baldwin took the temperature of the country and the cabinet. He found little support for Edward's marriage. The church leaders were firm. The royal family was stiff with disapproval. The governments in other parts of the empire were consulted, and their responses were not what Edward wanted. The world was telling him no. Edward responded like Edward. He dug in. He began to prepare for a confrontation. He wanted to speak to the nation directly. He imagined himself standing before microphones, telling the public he loved Wallis and intended to marry her, and he believed the public would melt and insist the government accept it. He believed his charm could override a system. Baldwin did not allow it. In the British system, the king does not speak to the nation on political matters without government approval. The king voice, when it is broadcast, carries national weight. If Edward used it to fight his own government, it would be a constitutional disaster in plain terms. It would mean the king and elected leaders were at war. Edward took this as proof that Baldwin was controlling him. He used the word dictatorship, which was melodramatic, and in Europe at that moment, a word that carried a darker shadow than Edward seemed to grasp. Wallis' friends, some of them less careful than they should have been, repeated that word at dinners, and those repeats made the situation feel even more dangerous. Wallis began to hear other whispers too, whispers about who was advising the king now. He had pushed away some of his old friends. He was relying more on his own small circle, on people who could feed his sense of being wronged. That circle included men who enjoyed feeling important and women who enjoyed feeling close to history. Not all of them were loyal. Some were simply entertained. One of the crueler parts of scandal is that people who claim to support you will sometimes push you towards disaster because it makes their own lives more exciting. Wallis understood that. She also understood she was not fully innocent in her own circle choices. She had liked witty, cynical people because they amused her. Now those same people were helping to create an atmosphere where Edward felt justified in dramatic gestures. She met with lawyers in France, trying to manage her own divorce preparations from afar. The conversations were dry, but the consequences were not. Each legal step required a public narrative. Each detail could be spun. Wallis could almost see her name in bold type, linked forever to words like adultery and immoral and unfit. She could hear her mother-old voice in her head, warning her about reputation as if reputation were a fragile plate. Wallis had never treated reputation like a plate. She treated it like armour, but armour can be dented beyond repair. Edward calls grew more frantic as the pressure on him increased. He would talk about being trapped. He would talk about betrayal. He would talk about how no one understood him. He would talk about how he would rather be a private man with Wallis than a king without her. At first, Wallis tried to soothe him, to talk him down, to remind him that time could help. Then she realized time was not helping. Time was making him more desperate. One night, after a particularly intense call, she sat with her head in her hands and felt the kind of exhaustion that makes your bones ache. It was not only fatigue, it was the awareness that she was losing the ability to guide him. She had been so confident in her skill with men. She had assumed she could handle Edward as she had handled others. But Edward was not only a man, he was a crown. He was a whole national myth, and a myth is not rational when it feels threatened. She began to consider something she had avoided. If she truly cared for him, perhaps she should let him go. That thought sounded noble, and it made her angry. Why should she have to be? Noble. Why should she be the one to surrender? Men had surrendered nothing for her in the past. Her first husband had chosen alcohol. Ernest had chosen convenience. Now Edward was choosing her, and everyone demanded she be the one to step aside for the sake of the nation. It was infuriating. It was also, perhaps, the only way to prevent the worst outcome. The trouble was that she did not fully believe Edward would let her step aside. He would interpret it as abandonment. He would cling harder. And if she left him, he might still abdicate out of spite or despair, and then she would have sacrificed him for nothing and still be blamed. In the middle of all this, a message arrived that made Wallis' stomach twist. Her name was being spoken in Britain churches, not kindly. Clergy were using her as an example of modern decadence, of loose morality, of the danger of foreign influence. It was not only gossip now, it was moral panic. Wallis read that, and felt her face go cold. She had been called rude, she had been called calculating, she had been called nasty. Those insults could be endured, but being cast as a national moral threat was different. It meant she was no longer merely disliked. She was being turned into a lesson. And lessons do not require compassion. Edward, meanwhile, was making the situation more public by the hour. He refused to separate himself from her in private. He insisted on sending her gifts and letters that could be traced. He allowed people to see his devotion. He behaved like a man who believed transparency would save him. In reality, it gave his opponents proof. Baldwin, seeing the situation harden, began to prepare for the possibilities of abdication. He consulted officials. He spoke quietly with members of Parliament. He discussed what would happen if the king stepped down. It was not a threat so much as a plan, because governments must plan for the worst even when it feels unthinkable. The royal family did the same in their own way. Bertie, the Duke of York, began to look haunted. His wife Elizabeth became more determined. Their home life tightened around a fearful possibility. Bertie did not want to be king, but he also could not allow the monarchy to be humiliated. He watched his brother drift towards the edge of a cliff and felt helpless, and helplessness in that family often turned into resentment. Wallis could sense that resentment growing, even from afar. She knew that if Edward stepped down, Bertie would inherit not only a crown but a mess, and he would never forgive the woman he believed caused it. There is a particular loneliness that comes from being blamed before the act is even complete. Wallis felt it. She felt herself becoming more isolated, more cautious about whom she trusted. Friends began to treat her differently too. Some spoke with sympathy that felt like pity. Some spoke with excitement that felt like greed. Some avoided her calls entirely, claiming they were busy, as if scandal could be caught through a telephone wire. At last, the pressure to leave France began to shift into pressure to stay away. The more public the situation became, the more people thought Wallis' presence in Britain would inflame everything. They wanted her out of sight. While they managed the king, they spoke as if it were for her protection. It might have been. It was also for their convenience. Edward, however, wanted her back. He wanted her physically near him, as if her presence could strengthen him against the government and the church. He sent messages urging her to return, promising he would handle everything, promising he would soon announce their plans, promising that love would win. Wallis did not believe love would win. Wallis believed stubbornness would collide with reality, and she did not know who would be crushed. She considered returning anyway because she feared what he might do in her absence. A desperate man left alone with his own anger is capable of terrible decisions. A desperate king is capable of historic ones. Finally, she chose a compromise. She did not return to Britain. She stayed close enough to travel quickly if needed, and far enough to give the appearance of distance. She moved to a place where reporters could not easily swarm her, though they tried. She accepted that she was, in effect, on display, and she began to behave like a woman on display. Calm, controlled, polished, carefully pleasant. Inside, she was tense as a wire. Then came the moment that made everything feel irreversible. Edward told Baldwin plainly that he intended to marry Wallis. Baldwin replied plainly that the government could not support it. Edward then let the word abdication fall into the room like a dropped glass. It was not theatrical in Baldwin retelling. It was almost matter of fact. That made it worse. It meant Edward had moved from sulking to decision. When Wallis heard that, she felt a surge of panic so sharp she nearly dropped the receiver. She called Edward immediately. He answered with a strange calm, the calm of a man who has finally chosen an action and feels relief in the choosing. "It will be fine," he said. "I can leave it all. We can live quietly." "Quietly," Wallis repeated, and there was a bitter edge in her voice she could not fully hide. "You think the world will allow us to live quietly?" Edward said. "They will have no choice." Wallis swallowed. "Do you hear yourself?" He said, "I hear myself, for the first time in my life." She wanted to reach through the line and shake him. She also wanted to cry, which would have infuriated her. Wallis did not like tears. Tears feel like losing. "If you do this," she said, "they will blame me forever." "They blame you already," Edward replied, and his voice softened. "Let them. We will have each other." It sounded tender. It was also terrifying, because it meant he was willing to trade a crown for a feeling, and he believed the feeling would be enough to replace everything he had been raised to be. Wallis said, "You cannot ask this of me." Edward said, "I am not asking. I am telling you what I will do." It was love, and it was control. Edward could not bear being controlled by others, so he tried to control the one person he believed he could not lose. After the call, Wallis sat in silence and listened to her own breathing. She tried to imagine life after abdication, a former king living abroad, cut off from duty, cut off from his family, carrying resentment like a suitcase, a woman blamed for a national rupture followed by hate, by curiosity, by gossip that would never die, a marriage that would not be protected by the dignity of the throne, only by the thin and unpredictable strength of two people, private bond. Wallis had always believed she could build her own safety. Now she could see that safety might be impossible. She could survive, yes, she could always survive. But could she live? A friend came to see her the next day and found her unusually quiet. The friend tried to make a joke, as people do when they are frightened and do not want to admit it. Wallis did not laugh. She said, "He means it." The friend looked away. "Then you must stop him." Wallis stared. "How?" The friend said softly, "Leave him." There it was again, the demand that the woman be the solution. Leave him. Save the crown. Save the country. Sacrifice yourself. Wallis felt something harden in her. Not cruelty exactly. Defiance. She had sacrificed enough in her life. She had endured enough. She had been controlled by enough men. She did not want to be told again that her job was to fix a man's choices by disappearing. And yet she could not escape the truth that if she stayed, Edward might destroy himself and drag others with him. If she left, he might destroy himself anyway, and she would still be blamed. The only thing she could control now was her own presence, whether she was near him when he made his decision or far away. She chose distance and then hated herself for choosing it. As the crisis approached its peak, Wallis became, in a way, a prisoner of her own reputation. She could not speak publicly without making things worse. She could not show emotion without feeding the narrative that she was either a schemer or a seductress. She could not be warm without being called false. She could not be cold without being called nasty. So she did what she always did. She held herself together and waited for the next blow. In London, the machinery of abdication began to move from private conversations to formal steps. The idea that had once been unthinkable became a practical question. How to do it? When? What words would be used? What would happen next? The royal family braced, the government prepared. The church leaders watched grimly. The newspapers, now fully awake, fed the public like a hungry animal, careful not to tear the monarchy apart but unable to resist the scent of drama. Edward, in the middle of it, seemed almost energized. He was furious, yes, but he was also alive. For a man who had always resented duty, this battle gave him purpose. He could cast himself as a man fighting for love against an uncaring system. He could feel heroic in his own story. Wallis, watching from afar, did not feel heroic at all. She felt like a woman staring at a door that was about to slam shut, not knowing whether she would be locked out or locked in. Then a message came that made her pulse jump. Edward wanted her to come, not to Britain, but to a place close enough that he could see her before everything was finalized. He wanted her there as he made his last stand. He wanted, perhaps, to show her that he was doing this for her, so she could never deny him. Wallis packed again, hands steady, heart not. She travelled under a cloud of attention, moving through stations and cars and lobbies with her chin lifted, as if she were merely a woman on holiday. She arrived in a place where the air was colder, the faces more cautious, the atmosphere charged with the knowledge that history was unfolding in rooms she could not enter. Edward came to her privately. When he walked into the room, he looked both regal and boyish, the strange combination that had always made women soften and men bristle. He took her hands and held them as if grounding himself. "It is almost done," he said. Wallis looked at him and felt a wave of emotion she could not easily name. Love, perhaps, in a certain twisted form. Fear, certainly. Anger, too, because he had forced this choice into the open. "You are making a mistake," she said, and her voice shook despite her effort. Edward smiled, and it was the smile of a man who believes he has finally chosen freedom. "No," he said, "I am making my life." Wallis wanted to tell him that life is not made only of what you want. It is made of what you can live with afterward. But she could see in his eyes that he was past listening. He was already living in the after, in the imagined quiet world where they would be together and everyone else would fade like background noise. Wallis looked at him and realized, with a clarity that made her feel cold, that nothing she said now would stop him. She could only decide how she would move within the collapse. Edward pulled her close and whispered that he loved her. Wallis let her head rest briefly against his shoulder and listened to his heartbeat, and in that moment she allowed herself to feel the simple human truth under the national drama. Two people had fallen into something they could not control. One of them was about to give up a crown. The other was about to become the most famous woman in the world for reasons she would never be allowed to explain. When Edward left the room, his hand lingering on hers as if reluctant to let go, Wallis stood at the window and watched the pale light outside. She could sense the country holding its breath. She could sense the royal family preparing to swallow their shock. She could sense Baldwin preparing to steady the nation. And she could sense, with a kind of resigned dread, that the next time she heard Edward's voice, it might be through a microphone, carried into millions of homes, announcing a choice that would turn her name into a curse in Britain for decades. She pressed her fingertips to the glass and whispered, "To no one, do not say my name." The next day, the microphones were set as if for a concert, polished and patient, waiting for a voice that had never truly belonged to itself. Edward sat in, a room that smelled of paper and old stone, and for once he did not look like a man playing at charm. He looked like a man who had slept badly and decided in the small hours that pride mattered more than repair. Outside, Britain went about its day with an unease it could not quite name. Shopkeepers folded black cloth and spoke of the late king in respectful tones. Housewives listened for scraps of information, the way women listen for a neighbour secret. Men on trains held newspapers open like shields and still managed to glance at the headlines. The country could feel a change coming, the kind of change that makes people tidy their homes, even if no guest is expected. Wallis waited on the other side of the water, close enough to feel the pull and far enough to be kept at a distance, in a room that felt too quiet for a woman whose name was being argued over in Parliament and pulpits. She sat with a cigarette and did not smoke it. She watched the clock. She thought about the way Edward's fingers had lingered on hers and about the way he had smiled when he said it was almost done, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with weather. When the broadcast began, it did not sound like romance. It sounded like resignation wrapped around stubbornness. Edward's voice came through, familiar and suddenly strange. He spoke of duty. He spoke of the impossible position. He spoke of the decision to step down. And then he said the line that turned millions of ordinary living rooms into little theatres of judgment. He said he could not carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman he loved. He did not say her name. Wallis closed her eyes anyway. It was not relief. It was the feeling of being called out without being spoken of, like someone pointing at you in a crowd. She could imagine the reaction in Britain, women turning their heads to one another, mouths tightening, someone saying, "So it is her," as if there had ever been a doubt. Edward's voice remained steady, but the steadiness was the kind that comes when a person is beyond persuasion. He was not begging the country to accept his choice. He was informing the country that his choice had been made. He ended with that warm, almost boyish tone he used when he wanted people to soften. He thanked them. He wished them well. He left behind a kingdom and called it an act of conscience. When the radio went quiet, Wallis remained still. She had told him not to say her name. He had not. That was the last gift of restraint he would offer Britain. Her phone began to ring soon after, friends with voices pitched high from excitement or fear. Some sounded triumphant, as if they had been waiting for history to deliver them a new story. Some sounded concerned in a way that made Wallis want to snap, because concern from people with safe lives can feel like smugness. One friend said, "He did it. He truly did it." Another said, "Do not come to England. Do you hear me? Do not come." Wallis listened, gave polite answers, ended calls quickly. She did not want opinions. She wanted information, and the information arrived fast, carried by the breathless machinery of government and press and family panic. Edward had signed papers that turned him, in a single stroke, from king to former king. The next king was his brother Bertie, who would now be George VI, a man who had never wanted the role and had always feared it. The entire royal family had been forced into a new shape overnight, and the strain showed in every rigid public appearance. Queen Mary was composed, as always, but the composure was sharper now, like a knife laid carefully on linen. The new Queen, Elizabeth, looked warm in public and fierce in private because she knew exactly what her husband was being handed. A crown, yes, also a wound. Edward would be given a title, the Duke of Windsor, an elegant solution that allowed Britain to treat him like a family member rather than a national emergency. It also allowed the royal household to move him out of the centre without saying the blunt truth. You cannot stay here. That title came with conditions. Conditions are the polite way powerful families punish without admitting it. Edward would have money, but not as freely as he expected. Edward would have a place in the family, but only in the way a disobedient relative is kept on the edge of photographs. Edward would have dignity, but only the portion the institution could spare. And Wallis would have nothing guaranteed at all. Edward wanted her beside him at once. He was frantic to bind the story tightly, to make the sacrifice feel purposeful. To him, the abdication was proof of love, and love deserved a prize. He wanted a marriage quickly, publicly, definitively. But Wallis was still married. The law and the church and the press waited, and none of them waited kindly. In Britain, the reaction was not uniform, but it was loud in the way public feeling can be loud even when spoken softly. Some people were sympathetic. They liked the idea of a man giving up power for love because it sounded like a story you could tell without thinking too hard about consequences. Many were angry. They felt embarrassed, as if the king had exposed something private and awkward about Britain to the world. Some were genuinely moralistic, horrified that the head of the Church of England had chosen a woman with a divorce and another marriage still standing, and plenty were simply relieved the problem seemed to have moved away. Relief, however, has a sharp edge. Relieved people can be cruel. Once the danger has passed, they feel free to sneer. Wallis read the foreign papers and saw herself described as if she were a creature, a temptress, a schemer, a cold American who had trapped a king. She knew the truth was more complicated, And she also knew complication does not sell papers. The public wanted a clear villain, and she fit the role too neatly. American, divorced, sharp-tongued, unapologetic. It was as if she had been built for blame. Edward wrote to her again and again, his letters now carrying a strange mixture of triumph and resentment. He spoke about freedom. He spoke about how the family had treated him. He spoke about Baldwin and the government as if they were petty enemies who had driven him away from his rightful home. He spoke as if he expected her to feel only gratitude. Wallis did feel something. It was not gratitude, it was dread. Because now they would have to live with what he had done, not in the abstract, not in the dramatic glow of a broadcast, but in the daily reality of money, invitations, titles, and the cold social calculus of who will be seen with you. The first battle was over something that would sound trivial to outsiders and felt like a war to the people involved. Style, the little letters and forms of address that define rank in Britain. Edward, even without the crown, wanted to keep the style of Royal Highness. It mattered to him. It was proof he had not been demoted to an ordinary man. It was proof he had simply stepped aside by choice. The government and the new king agreed Edward could keep it. It was a compromise, and it was also a leash. Fine, keep your style, but remember it belongs to the institution you left. Then came the question Wallis cared about more than she pretended. Would she have it too when they married? To Wallis, the style was not only vanity, it was protection. It would shield her from being treated like a social interloper. It would signal legitimacy. It would force people to bow and smile and include her, even if they hated it. And Wallis, whatever her flaws, understood something deeply. A woman without formal protection in that world can be destroyed by polite exclusion. Edward insisted she should have it. He argued it like a man who still believed his feelings should make policy. He spoke to his brother with indignation, to his mother with wounded pride, to advisers with a stubborn certainty that sounded brave and was, in truth, childish. George VI listened and did not give in. Bertie, now king, was already under strain. His stammer, his anxiety, his dread of public speaking, all of it had been pulled into the spotlight. He had to present a steady monarchy after a scandal that had made it look fragile. The last thing he could do was reward the woman the country blamed. He could not make his reign begin with Britain bowing to Wallis Simpson. Queen Mary, cold and unyielding, supported him. The new Queen, Elizabeth, supported him too, and her support had a special ferocity because she was thinking not only about duty, but about her children. Her daughters would grow up in a family that had been publicly humiliated by Edward Choice. She would not allow the woman associated with that humiliation to gain status within their circle. So the decision was made, and it was delivered in the calm tone powerful people use when they want to sound reasonable while cutting you. Wallis would not have the style. She could be a duchess, yes. She could have a title derived from Edward's new title, yes. But she would not be Royal Highness. She would not be family in the formal sense. When Wallis heard this, she reacted with the kind of control fury that can freeze a room. She was not a woman who liked half measures, and she was certainly not a woman who liked being reminded she was not wanted. Edward raged on her behalf, which should have been flattering. It also revealed something uncomfortable. He had given up a crown and still could not get her. Fully accepted. He was now a man who had sacrificed everything he claimed to value, and still the institution held the final card. That realization made him more bitter, and bitterness is a poor foundation for a marriage. Wallis wrote back with careful words, but her private remarks to friends were sharper. She called the family petty. She called the new king weak. She called the whole thing mean-spirited. Some of those remarks slipped out of her circle because friends are not always loyal when a story is valuable. Those leaks only confirmed to Britain what many already wanted to believe. She was ungrateful, She was nasty. She was never satisfied. The divorce moved forward, ugly in its own tidy way. Ernest Simpson was not dramatic. He wanted out with as little humiliation as possible, and he wanted to keep his own standing. The solution in those days often required a staged narrative of fault, a kind of agreed-upon story that would satisfy the court. It was a private mess turned into a public script, and it left everyone feeling faintly dirty. Wallis endured it with her chin up. She did not like being dragged through moral judgment by strangers. She did not like having her private life discussed like a case study. But she wanted the marriage to Edward, and now she had to take the path that would allow it. If she had once enjoyed the thrill of the affair, she did not enjoy this. This was not glamour. This was paperwork and gossip and the slow stripping away of privacy. Edward, impatient as ever, treated the divorce as an obstacle that should simply move, because he was tired of it. He sent messages asking when, how soon, what next. He seemed to think the legal process would respond to desire. Wallis had to remind him, gently and repeatedly, that the world did not rearrange itself just because a former king wished it. As the divorce became public, the language around Wallis became uglier. Some British voices spoke about her as if she were a national humiliation. Letters were written, sermons were preached, jokes were made that carried poison under the laughter. Even people who thought the whole thing was over began to speak of her with a sharpness that surprised American observers. The British can be courteous until they decide someone has broken a sacred rule. Then the courtesy becomes a weapon. Wallis also began to feel the subtle punishments of social life. Some old friends stopped calling. Some suddenly became too busy. Some were affectionate in private and distant in public because they did not want to be seen supporting her. Others, those who loved scandal, drew closer, eager to be invited to whatever glittering exile Edward and Wallis would create. Wallis watched these shifts and made notes in her mind. She had always known social life was a bargain. Now she was watching the bargain being renegotiated in real time. Edward himself was learning a harsher lesson. Without the crown, he was still famous, still royal by blood, still charming. But he was no longer central. He could no longer command the same obedience. He could not simply order a household, a government, a nation. He had to ask, and Edward was terrible at asking. He asked his brother for money, for allowances, for arrangements. He asked with entitlement, as if the family owed him comfort in exchange for his sacrifice. George VI gave him an income, but not the freedom Edward wanted. And each limit felt to Edward like betrayal. The resentment grew. Wallis, watching that resentment, began to see what life with Edward might actually be. She had once been drawn to his charm, his attention, the way he made her feel chosen. Now she was facing the prospect of living with a man who might spend decades angry at the world for not giving him everything he wanted. A charming man in love is delightful. A charming man in grievance is exhausting. Still, she was not about to back away now. She had been blamed already. She might as well secure the one thing that could justify the wreckage in her own mind: marriage, legitimacy, a name that would, at least, be hers. When the divorce was finalised, the pace accelerated. Edward wanted a wedding that felt like a coronation of their love. The British establishment wanted the opposite. They wanted it done quietly, away from England, away from cameras, away from any ceremony that might look like the monarchy blessing what it had condemned. The compromise was exile dressed as romance, a wedding in France. Wallis travelled to the chosen place with a tight circle of friends, the kind who enjoyed being present at a moment the history books would mention. The house was elegant, the air warm, the landscape calm in the way France can be calm, even when the world is upset. The setting suggested a love story. The guest list suggested a punishment. No senior member of the royal family attended, not one. The absence was not an accident. It was a message. You may marry him, but you will not be welcomed. Edward arrived, looking pleased and tense at once. He dressed with great care, as if clothing could restore the sense of importance he had lost. He greeted friends with a brightness that did not fully mask the ache underneath. He wanted this to be joyful. He also wanted the world, and especially his family, to feel the sting of his choice. Wallis dressed beautifully, of course. She understood that history is often reduced to images, and she intended to control at least the image. Her face was composed, her posture perfect, her smile measured. People later described her as cold, and in those moments she probably was. Coldness is how a woman holds herself steady when the room is full of judgment. When the ceremony began, it was brief, restrained, more like a legal turning of a page than a public celebration. And yet inside it, something enormous was happening. A man who had been king stood in a quiet French room and married a woman Britain considered unfit. The world watched and whispered, and in Britain many did not see romance. They saw a warning. Edward called her his Duchess afterward with a tenderness that was almost boyish. He looked at her as if she had rescued him. Wallis looked at him as if she were trying to feel the rescue too. The title came with its own sting. She was the Duchess of Windsor, yes, but she was not Royal Highness. The difference would haunt her. People would bow, but not with the full weight of royal protocol. Courtiers would curtsy, but with a careful coolness. Invitations would be extended, then withdrawn. Doors would open, then close again. It would always be clear she was not fully included. Wallis, who had spent her life clawing toward inclusion, found that half inclusion is sometimes worse than exclusion. At least with exclusion, you know where you stand. Edward tried to compensate with devotion. He insisted people use her title. He corrected those who slighted her. He wrote furious letters. He nursed the grievance like a pet, feeding it and expecting it to grow into justice. Wallis did not always discourage this. Part of her enjoyed watching men fight for her. Part of her believed, perhaps, that he owed her a fight after dragging her through a national disaster. They set up their life in a way that looked glamorous from the outside. Travel, parties, friends with beautiful clothes and sharp jokes. They moved through Europe with the aura of glamorous exile. The sort of couple people wanted to see in a hotel lobby just so they could tell the story later. Edward loved the attention. Wallis loved the control of appearing unbothered. But privately, the marriage settled into its true shape. Edward was affectionate, needy, and often moody. He wanted Wallis close, always. He wanted her to reassure him, always. He wanted her to laugh at his jokes and soothe his anger and validate his sacrifice. Wallis could do those things, but not endlessly, not without cost. And Wallis, now that she had the husband she had fought the world to claim, sometimes seemed almost impatient with him. She had wanted power and safety and status, and instead she had gained a former king with a wounded ego and a nation that despised her. She had gained a title that did not fully protect her and a man who expected her to be grateful for the cage they now shared. She could be sharp with him. She could correct him in front of friends, the way she always had. And now the correction landed differently. Before, it had been flirtation, a clever woman teasing a prince. Now it could look like a wife scolding a man who had lost his throne for her. People watching began to ask themselves a cruel question. Did she even love him? Love is not always the point in marriages like this. Sometimes the point is survival, and survival does not always look tender. Edward was also beginning to learn that outside the royal circle, his charm did not always win. He could be invited, yes, he could be feted, but he was no longer a symbol of the future. He was a reminder of embarrassment. Some hosts loved that. Others wanted nothing to do with it. Doors that would have opened instantly for a king now opened only if someone saw advantage. Wallis, who had spent years navigating advantage, adjusted more easily than he did. She knew how to flatter. She knew how to make herself useful. She knew how to turn attention into invitation. Edward expected invitations as a right. The difference between them became more visible. There were moments, quiet ones, when Wallis let herself think about what she had lost. Not earnest, not really, not the marriage that had become a formality. She had lost the possibility of ever being accepted in Britain. She had lost the comfort of walking into a room without wondering what story people had heard about her. She had lost, in a strange way, her own privacy as a human being. Edward had lost his crown, but he could still be treated with a kind of nostalgic respect. He could be forgiven as a romantic fool. Wallis would not be forgiven. She would be remembered as the reason, and reasons are punished more than actors. She began to show it in small ways, a tightness around the mouth when someone mentioned England, a flash of annoyance when Edward spoke wistfully about his old life, a brittle joke about the royal family that made some friends laugh and others shift uncomfortably. The bitterness was not only Edward, it began to live in her too. And yet, for all the tension, there were also moments of real closeness. Edward could be gentle. He could be attentive in the daily way that matters more than grand gestures. He would notice when she was tired, when she was irritated, when she needed quiet. He would bring her little comforts. He would fuss over her like a man trying to prove his devotion every day. Wallis would soften sometimes, almost against her will. She would lean into his affection. She would laugh genuinely. She would let her guard drop for an hour, and in those hours you could see what might have been if the world had not made them a symbol. But symbols do not get holidays. In Britain, George VI began his reign with a determination that came from fear. He knew the monarchy had been shaken. He knew he had to restore trust. He worked harder than Edward ever had at public duty. Not because he loved it, but because he feared the consequences of failing. His wife supported him with warmth and strategy. She smiled in public and organised in private. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the monarchy survived not through glamour, but through steady behaviour. The contrast between the new king and the former king became part of the story. George VI was dutiful, Edward was selfish, Elizabeth was devoted, Wallis was grasping. The public likes contrasts. They make judgment easy. Queen Mary, watching her younger son settle into the role Edward had thrown away, did not soften. If anything, she hardened. She treated Edward as someone who had failed to the family, and she treated Wallis as the visible face of that failure. To those close to her, she could be icy about it. She did not need to shout. Her disapproval had the weight of centuries. Edward wrote to his mother anyway because he still wanted her approval, even as he claimed to despise her rules. That contradiction lived in him, always. He wanted to be free from the family and also wanted the family to validate his freedom. He wanted to punish them and be welcomed back. He wanted to be the wounded son and the defiant hero at the same time. Wallis watched these impulses and sometimes felt contempt, sometimes felt pity. She had been raised with far less, and she had learned to accept reality in a way Edward never truly had. When he sulked about his brother not giving him enough money or not granting her the style she wanted, Wallis would sometimes snap, then catch herself. She had spent years building this outcome. She could not afford to look disappointed now. The first months after the wedding were a strange mixture of glitter and strain. Their parties were talked about. Their clothes were admired. Their marriage was dissected. Every gesture between them was interpreted as evidence. If Wallis smiled at him, it was proof she was satisfied. If she looked away, it was proof she was cold. If Edward clung, it was proof he was devoted. If he sulked, it was proof he regretted everything. Wallis learned to perform happiness. It was easier than explaining complexity. One evening, after a dinner where guests had been a little too eager, a little too curious, Edward turned to Wallis as they prepared for bed and said, almost tenderly, Now they must accept you." Wallis looked at him, and for a moment she saw the boy in him again, the boy who believed love could command the world. "They do not have to accept me," she said. "They only have to live with me." Edward frowned. "That is the same thing." Wallis almost smiled. It was not the same thing, and she knew, with a certainty that did not comfort her, that Britain would live with her the way it lives with a bad scar, always aware of it, always irritated by it, always ready to blame it for any pain nearby. She went to the window that night and looked out at the dark, and she thought about the radio, about that careful phrase, "the woman I love." He had spared her name, but he had not spared her fate. Her name was now lodged in Britain's story, whether it was spoken or not. And in the quiet of that room, with Edward breathing behind her, Wallis admitted to herself a truth she had not wanted to face. They had won, in the narrow sense. They were married. They were together. He had chosen her. But winning had not made the world kinder. It had not made Edward simpler. It had not made her feel safe. It had only made everything permanent. Permanent is a cruel word when you are talking about love. It makes you realize that the romance has to survive breakfast, money, boredom, and the particular misery of being stared at by strangers who feel entitled to an opinion. The Duke of Windsor woke up each morning still half convinced he had outsmarted history. The Duchess woke up each morning already aware that history had simply moved into their bedroom and taken a seat. At first, Edward tried to make their exile feel like a triumph. He chose the grand hotels, the beautiful villas, the kind of dining rooms where the silver shines even when the conversation is icy. He insisted on being treated like royalty, which in a sense he still was. He was royal blood, a former king, a man with the sort of name that made people stand straighter even when they disliked him. He wanted doors to open. He wanted the world to prove he had not been diminished. Wallis wanted something more practical. She wanted protection through formality. She wanted invitations that were not laced with mockery. She wanted the style of Royal Highness because it would force people, at least on paper, to show her respect. When she did not get it, she did what proud women do when they feel cornered. She became sharper. There were little scenes that friends the later repeated with delight because society. Love's a private quarrel. It can retell as a public moral lesson. Edward correcting a hostess who failed to curtsy deeply enough. Wallis snapping at a servant for a mistake that did not matter. Wallis refusing to attend a dinner if the seating did not place her where she believed she belonged. Edward sulking for hours because a letter from his brother was too stiff. These were not crimes. They were the day-to-day symptoms of two people trying to build a kingdom out of wounded pride. And the pride was not only Edward. Wallis had always been proud. Pride had been her survival. Now pride became her posture, her shield, her excuse. She could be charming when she chose, dazzling even, a woman with an eye for beauty and a mind for social chess. But she could also be cutting, and when she was cutting she did not always bother to hide it. The people who loved her loved that about her. The people who hated her used it as proof. Britain, watching from across the water, did not soften. If anything, it hardened. The abdication had not been a romantic story to many Britons. It had been a disruption, an embarrassment, a moment when the monarchy had looked frighteningly human. The new king and queen worked hard to restore steadiness, and the easiest way to make steadiness shine was to keep the Duke and Duchess in a kind of polite shadow. The Duchess was not invited back as family. She was not welcomed at court. When her name was mentioned, it was often as a hiss, "that woman." It was a phrase that carried class judgment, sexual judgment, national judgment, all packed into two small words, and Wallis, who had never liked being dismissed, could feel that dismissal burning like a rash she could not scratch. Edward wrote letters that grew darker. He complained about his brother. He complained about his mother. He complained about the government. He saw betrayal everywhere because betrayal made him feel like a victim instead of a man who had chosen this. He would read a newspaper and interpret a polite reference as an insult. He would hear that the new king was praised for duty and interpret it as a deliberate comparison meant to shame him. Wallis tried sometimes to pull him back from that mood. Sometimes she fed it. It depended on the day. Living with a resentful man is exhausting. Living with a resentful man who used to be king can feel like breathing in a room with low oxygen. Still, they knew how to throw a party. They knew how to dress. They knew how to make other people feel slightly thrilled to be near them. Their dinners in France became a kind of theatre. The glamorous fallen king and his brilliant duchess, surrounded by socialites, millionaires, and the sort of aristocrats who enjoyed being near scandal as long as it did not stain them permanently. Wallis was brilliant at these gatherings. She controlled the guest list like a weapon. She used seating to reward loyalty and punish slights. She could make someone feel adored with a glance and then dismissed with a pause. She loved the power of the room because it was a power she could actually hold. Britain could deny her the palace, but it could not deny her the small empire of a dining table. Then came the moment when the stories stopped being only about romance and started to smell, unmistakably, like danger. In the year after their marriage, the Duke and Duchess went to Germany. It was presented as a tour, a curiosity, a way to see the modern world. Europe was tense, full of bluster and fear, full of leaders making speeches that sounded like theatre until you realised they were arming the stage. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, was not merely another country to visit. It was a country turning itself into a threat. Edward and Wallis went anyway. The trip was full of staged welcomes, salutes, crowds arranged to cheer. They toured factories and greeted officials. They smiled for cameras, and then in the moment that would cling to them like smoke, they met Hitler. Photographs exist. A former king, a woman Britain already resented, standing near a man who would soon bring horror to Europe. The image did not need explanation to feel wrong. Even people who did not follow politics could sense the ugliness in it. Edward insisted later that he was simply trying to understand Germany, that he was interested in preventing war, that he believed conversation mattered. Some people believed him. Others did not. The problem was not only what he intended, the problem was what it looked like. It looked like vanity at best, sympathy at worst. It looked like a couple so hungry for importance that they were willing to be used as a prop by a dictatorship. Wallis did not help by seeming, in certain accounts, to enjoy the attention. She always enjoyed attention, but this was not a ballroom. This was a regime staging itself as destiny. The Duchess did not behave like a frightened guest. She behaved like a woman receiving an elaborate welcome, and the world did not forgive the tone. Back in Britain, the anger sharpened. People who had grudgingly allowed themselves to think the abdication was simply a private matter began to rethink it. They began to see Edward not as a romantic fool, but as a reckless man with poor judgment. And Wallis, already cast as the corrupting influence, became an even easier target. If she was nasty before, people now called her dangerous. The gossip grew teeth. Stories circulated that German officials believed Edward could be useful, that he might be persuaded, that he might even be restored one day under a different political arrangement. Historians would later debate the seriousness of these ideas, but the very existence of the whispers was poison. In politics, even the suggestion of divided loyalty can ruin you. Edward and Wallis returned to France, still determined to live grandly, still convinced they were misunderstood. They did not fully grasp how badly they had stepped in it. Or perhaps they grasped and refused to care. Refusal can look like courage to the person doing it and like arrogance to everyone else. Then the world tipped into war. When war came, it did not arrive as a polite announcement. It arrived as fear, as borders tightening, as people watching maps the way they watch a fever. France became less safe. The Duke and Duchess were no longer merely glamorous exiles. They were high-value symbols, a former king with the wrong friends and a wife everyone loved to blame. They became a potential problem. For Britain, at the exact moment Britain could not afford problems. They fled as armies moved. They went south, then to Spain, then to Portugal, moving with suitcases and a circle of anxious friends. Their travel was watched. Their names were discussed in government rooms with the kind of seriousness that strips away glamour. There were concerns, real concerns, about whether the Duke might be approached by German agents, whether he might be tempted by promises of status, whether his bitterness could be turned into something worse. Wallis, in Portugal, lived in a state of tight tension. She had always been a woman who liked control. Now she was in a world where control belonged to generals and dictators and men with guns. She could dress beautifully, but she could not dress her way out of this. Britain decided, in plain terms, to remove the Duke from the board. Edward was given a job that sounded respectable and was in reality a form of exile with a uniform. He was appointed governor of the Bahamas, a British colony far from Europe. It was framed as service. It was also a way to keep him away from the centres of power and away from any temptation to play politics on the continent. Edward was furious at first. He wanted a grand role. He wanted importance. He did not want to be sent to an island as if he were a troublesome relative being packed off to the countryside. But he went, because he had little choice, and because refusing would have made him look even more suspicious. Wallis went with him, of course. She was his wife now, and wives in those stories go where the husband goes. But the Bahamas were not Paris. They were not the glittering salons of Europe. They were heat, humidity, mosquitoes, and a society divided by race and class in ways that were brutal and visible. Wallis, who had always cared about the polish of her surroundings, found herself in a place that would not be polished for her. She hated it. People later tried to soften that with language, saying she found it challenging, that she struggled with the climate. But it was more than climate. It was the feeling of being far from the world that fed her. It was the feeling of being surrounded by a reality that could not be managed with etiquette. It was also, for a woman raised in the American South of that era, the discomfort of colonial life that demanded a certain kind of blindness and rewarded it. Edward tried to behave like a governor. He made speeches. He inspected projects. He posed for photographs. He also complained endlessly. He complained about the lack of proper staff. He complained about the island being dull. He complained about not being treated with enough respect. He complained about his brother not sending enough money. He complained about everyone. Wallis, trapped in the governor residence like a duchess in a badly decorated cage, took her frustration out the way many powerful women take it out when they feel powerless. She became more demanding. She became sharper with staff. She insisted on certain comforts. She threw parties anyway because parties were her way of creating a world she could recognize. The guests were fewer, the glamour thinner, the mood strained by war and distance. But she tried. The Bahamas were also a place of real suffering. There was poverty. There was racial injustice. There were tensions that could erupt into anger. Edward, to his credit, did sometimes speak about poverty with genuine feeling. He had always had a streak of concern for ordinary people, at least in theory. But concern without deep understanding can become clumsy, and he was not a skilled administrator. He had been raised to wave and charm, not to manage a colony in wartime. One of the strangest, darkest episodes of their island years involved a murder that shook the colony, the killing of a wealthy man named Sir Harry Oakes. The case became a spectacle, full of rumours, accusations and incompetence. Edward's involvement in how it was handled was criticised, and the whole thing left a sour taste that clung to his reputation. Scandals seemed to follow them like a shadow, no matter how far the government tried to move them from London. Wallis endured the Bahamas by counting the days until she could return to a world with better champagne and less sweat. She wrote letters. She flirted, perhaps, with the idea of influence through other channels. Gossip about her behaviour in those years has always been rich and often unfair. People like to imagine that she was constantly scheming, constantly seducing, constantly plotting. The truth is likely less cinematic and more human. She was bored, she was irritated, she felt punished, and she did not have the emotional softness to hide those feelings politely. Edward and Wallis' marriage, under the pressure of isolation and war, showed its cracks more clearly. Edward needed constant reassurance. Wallis needed space. Edward wanted to be the wounded hero. Wallis wanted to be the admired duchess. They could still be tender with each other, but the tenderness came mixed with resentment, like sugar stirred into bitter tea. When the war finally ended, they returned to Europe with relief and with a new problem. Now the world knew, in a way it had not known before, what Germany had been, what the regime had done, how horrific and unforgivable it was. And in that new moral landscape, their earlier trip to Germany looked even worse. Documents captured after the war suggested German interest in Edward and hinted at his bitterness toward Britain. Historians would argue over what was fantasy, what was propaganda, what was real, but the stain did not require certainty. It required only suspicion. Suspicion is enough to keep doors closed. The Duke and Duchess settled again in Paris, in a life that looked from the outside like endless elegance. They had a house, staff, clothes, dinners. They knew the right people. They moved in circles where scandal could be treated like seasoning. But their position was never fully comfortable. They were famous, yes. They were also kept at arm's length by the very institution Edward had once embodied. Edward continued to fight endlessly for what he believed he deserved. More money, more status, more invitations, a larger role. The style for Wallis. He wrote letters that grew increasingly bitter, demanding recognition and fairness. The royal household responded with polite firmness, giving enough to keep him from becoming desperate, not enough to let him feel powerful. Wallis watched him age into grievance. It is a quiet tragedy to see a charming man become a sour one, because the sourness erases the charm and leaves behind only need. Edward would replay the abdication as if it were a martyrdom. He told the story in a way that made him noble and made the family cold. Wallis was often cast as the reason, the love worth sacrificing for. She did not always correct him, because correcting him would require admitting, perhaps, that the sacrifice had not produced the happiness he imagined. They continued to throw parties, and the parties were often spectacular. Wallis had an eye for beauty that never left her. She curated rooms the way other women curate wardrobes. She chose flowers, china, guests, topics. She knew how to keep conversation alive and how to kill it with a look. She became, in a sense, what she had always wanted to be, a woman at the centre of a glittering world. But glitter can be lonely when you know half the smiles are curiosity, not love. There were gossip stories, endless ones, about Wallis and other men, about flirtations, about affairs. Some biographers have suggested she had lovers before Edward, and perhaps even after, that she did not experience love the way Edward did, that she valued control more than devotion. It is possible. It is also possible that much of it was projection, a way to explain why she did not behave like a grateful heroine in a romance novel. A woman who does not perform softness is often accused of having no heart. What is clear is that Edward's devotion remained intense, and his fear of losing her never fully faded. That fear made him clingy, and clingy love can drive a partner away emotionally, even if she stays physically. Wallis stayed. Sometimes she stayed with affection. Sometimes she stayed with resignation. Sometimes she stayed because leaving would have made the whole story collapse into meaninglessness. They had no children. That fact always hovered, unspoken. Children might have softened their exile, given them a purpose beyond parties and grievance. They did not have that. They had each other, and a marriage built on a national rupture and the long echo of public judgment. In Britain, the royal family moved forward. George VI and Queen Elizabeth became symbols of steadiness during the war. Their courage, their willingness to remain in London during bombings, their visible commitment to duty, all of it earned deep affection. When their daughter Elizabeth became queen in the early 1950s, the monarchy had a new face, a new era. The Duke of Windsor became more and more like a story from an older scandal, something people remembered with a shiver and a hint of fascination. Wallis, however, never stopped being a sore point. Even as decades passed, she was still the woman who had taken a king away. People did not speak of her as a duchess. They spoke of her as a disruption. It was as if Britain could forgive Edward for being weak, but could not forgive Wallis for being strong. There were small moments of contact with the royal family over the years, carefully managed, stiff with protocol. When Edward was allowed to attend certain family occasions, it was often under conditions. Wallis might be included in a limited way, then excluded again. Each inclusion was a reminder of exclusion. Each brief encounter was a performance, smiles that did not warm. The eyes, embraces that looked polite in photographs and felt complicated in private. Wallis kept score. She always kept score. As they aged, the glamour became harder to maintain. Edward's health began to fail. He smoked heavily for years, and his body paid the price. He grew thinner, more fragile. The charming smile became less effortless. The old resentment remained, sometimes softened by fatigue, sometimes sharpened by it. Wallis became more protective, but also more impatient. Caring for a difficult man is not the same as loving him, though it can contain love. It also contains duty, and Wallis had never wanted duty. She had wanted freedom. And yet in the end, she did duty in her own way. She attended to him. She watched over him. She managed the household. She endured the slow narrowing of his world. She sat beside him in hospitals, in rooms that smelled like antiseptic and loss, and she did it without theatrical tears, because theatrical tears were never her style. Edward died in Paris in the early 1970s. The end was not glamorous. The end never is. It was illness, weakness, the quiet extinguishing of a man who had once been the centre of an empire. Wallis, at his deathbed, was not a wicked queen gloating over conquest. She was an aging woman who had lived inside a story that never let her rest. The funeral drew attention, of course. Britain could not ignore the death of a former king. The royal family attended because duty demanded it, and because grief, however complicated, is still grief. There were photographs of solemn faces, of stiff gestures, of a family performing unity around a man who had broken them. Wallis moved through it like a figure carved from restraint. People watching tried to read her face for the truth of their story, and of course they found what they wanted. Those who hated her saw coldness. Those who pitied her saw loneliness. Those who loved scandal saw a final act. Edward's body was buried at Frogmore near Windsor, close enough to the royal family to look merciful and far enough to remain controlled. Wallis would eventually be buried near him, as if the story needed that final symmetry. After Edward died, Wallis' life did not become easier. If anything, it became quieter in a way that felt like punishment. Edward had been exhausting, but he had also been a purpose. Without him, she was a duchess without a court, a famous woman without a role, a symbol without the man who had turned her into one. Friends still visited at first. Some came out of affection, some came out of curiosity. Some came because they wanted to be able to say years later that they had sat in Wallis' living room. But as time passed, the visits thinned. Wallis, aged and aging, does not flatter a woman who built her power on control. Her health declined. Reports from those years describe her as increasingly frail, increasingly withdrawn, and eventually suffering from severe mental decline. There was also a later scandal, quieter but ugly, involving the management of her life and estate. A lawyer who took charge of her affairs, Suzanne Blum, became a figure of controversy, accused by some of isolating Wallis and controlling access to her, of turning the Duchess' final years into a locked room where decisions were made by others. The details were argued and litigated, and whispered about, as people always do when there is money and a famous lonely woman at the end of her story. The gossip around it was vicious, because gossip loves a fallen ending. People who had once called Wallis a schemer enjoyed imagining her finally being outmaneuvered. It was a cruel satisfaction, and it said more about the public appetite than about Wallis herself. In those last years, Wallis was no longer the sharp woman with the cutting tongue. She was a fragile figure, often unable to recognize old friends. Her world narrowed to rooms and nurses and the slow fade of memory. It is hard to know what she felt then, because she could no longer tell her own version. Perhaps that was the final punishment. For a woman who had always managed her image, she ended as a woman whose image was managed by others. She died in the mid-1980s, and Britain, predictably, did not turn into a nation of mourners. There was polite acknowledgement, there was fascination. There was the lingering sense that a long scandal had finally closed its book, and still, even at the end, the tone remained icy. The royal family allowed her burial near Edward, a gesture that looked gracious and also contained. She was placed beside him, as if the story could be neatly sealed in the ground. But stories like this do not stay buried. They live in the way people tell them. So why did Britain never forgive her? Because she was foreign, and the British can be deeply sentimental about their own rules. Because she was divorced, and at that moment in history, divorce was not treated as a human complication, but as a moral stain. Because she did not behave like a penitent. Because she did not bow her head and beg forgiveness. Because she seemed, to many eyes, to enjoy the power she had gained. Because she could be rude, and because rudeness from a woman is treated as a sin in a way rudeness from a man is treated as personality. Because Edward made his weakness her fault. That is the part that lingers like perfume long after the woman has left the room. Edward abdicated and was still granted nostalgia. He could be the romantic king who chose love. Wallis became the woman who tempted him away from duty. People preferred the fairy tale, and fairy tales need a witch, and yet if you look closely, the story refuses to stay simple. Wallis did not march into Britain and demand a crown. She did not have the legal power to force Edward's hand. Edward was a grown man who made his own choice, and he made it stubbornly. He wanted what he wanted, and he had never learned how to want modestly. Wallis did not invent that. She simply stepped into the space his hunger created. She was also not a saint. She could be cruel, she could be dismissive, she could be vain. She could treat people as tools, because she had spent her life being treated as a tool by men and by society. She learned that the only way not to be used was to use first. That is not admirable, but it is understandable. If you want the simplest truth, it is this. Britain did not forgive her because Britain did not want to forgive a woman who made the monarchy look like it could be shaken by desire. The monarchy survives on the illusion of inevitability. Wallis made it look optional, and that frightened people. In the end, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor got their marriage, their title, their parties, their shared life. They also got exile, resentment, suspicion, and the slow ache of being permanently on the outside of the very world that had made them. If you could have watched them in a quiet moment, years after the microphones and the headlines, you might have seen something that does not fit neatly into villain and victim. A man who gave up a crown and never stopped needing to be admired for it. A woman who won the man and still lost the country. Two people trapped in a love story that the world insisted on turning into a morality tale. Britain moved on. It always does. But it did not forget. Even now, her name carries a sting in certain mouths, a shorthand for disruption, for scandal, for the fear of a woman who does not behave as expected. And perhaps that is the final irony. Wallis Simpson wanted control over her life. She got it for a moment, dazzling and dangerous. Then she spent the rest of her life living inside a story other people told about her, a story that never allowed her the one thing she craved most, to be safe.